Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I'd never been so glad to see the cabin. The November chill had worked its way through my jacket, and my fingers felt stiff on the steering wheel as I pulled up the dirt driveway. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the small wooden structure that had belonged to my family for 3 generations. "Finally," Arden said from the passenger seat, his breath visible in the cold air of the car. "I thought we'd never get back." "You're the one who wanted to stay for the last song," Tessa teased from the back seat, her voice still carrying the excitement from the dance in Weaverville. "Worth it," Dominic chimed in. "Did you see how many people showed up? Must have been half the county. I killed the engine, and for a moment we sat in silence. The darkness out here was complete. No streetlights, no neighboring homes, just the vast wilderness of Trinity County surrounding us on all sides. The moon hung overhead, nearly full, casting a pale glow across the clearing where my grandfather had built this cabin back in '32. "Let's get inside," I said, grabbing the guitar case from the trunk. "It's freezing out here." The cabin was cold inside, but it wouldn't take long to warm up. I knelt in front of the fireplace, arranging kindling and logs, while Arden struck a match. Within minutes, flames were licking at the dry wood, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Tessa threw herself onto the worn sofa. "God, my feet are killing me. Remind me never to wear these shoes again." She kicked off her heels, rubbing her stockinged feet. Dominic pulled a bottle of whiskey from his bag. "A little something to warm us up." The fire grew stronger, filling the small space with light and heat. We shed our coats, finally comfortable after the long drive back from town. I took my guitar from its case and sat on the hearth, feeling the warmth against my back. "Play something, Marcus," Tessa said, accepting a glass from Dominic. I positioned my fingers on the frets but stopped. Damn, the cold got to it. It's out of tune. I began twisting the pegs, plucking strings, listening for the right notes. The familiar ritual was calming, focusing my attention on something simple and methodical after a night of noise and conversation. That's when we heard it. A sound cut through the night, high-pitched, wavering, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I froze, my hand still on the guitar strings. "What the hell was that?" Arden whispered, his body suddenly tense. We all looked at each other. Nobody moved. The sound came again, louder this time. A wail that started low before climbing to a pitch that made my skin crawl. Not a coyote, not a wolf, not a mountain lion, not anything I recognized from 25 years of living in these mountains. "Is that a person?" Tessa's voice shook. Her face had gone pale. "No way," Dominic said, but there was no conviction in his words. I set the guitar down carefully and moved to the window. The others followed, crowding behind me, peering into the darkness beyond the glass. The moonlight revealed the yard, the tree line, and further up, the old rock bluffs that rose about 80 yards from the cabin. The wail came again. This time, I could pinpoint its source, the top of those bluffs. "Someone's hurt," Arden suggested, not sounding convinced. "Maybe a hiker fell." "In November? At night?" I shook my head. "Nobody hikes up there this time of year." The cry continued, rising and falling in a pattern that felt almost deliberate. It wasn't random screaming. There was something rhythmic about it, something that felt communicative. "We should check," Dominic said, already reaching for his coat. I placed a hand on his arm. "Let's go out on the porch first. Listen better." We stepped outside, the cold air hitting us like a slap. The sound was clearer now, unmuffled by the cabin walls. It echoed across the clearing, bouncing off the trees and rocks. The wail lasted several minutes, stopping briefly before starting again. Standing on that porch, listening to that sound, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a child. Pure, instinctive fear. Not nervousness, not concern, but deep, primal terror that reached down into the most ancient parts of my brain and screamed at me to run. I looked at my friends' faces, illuminated by the light spilling from the cabin windows. They felt it too. I could see it in their wide eyes, their frozen postures. "Inside," I whispered, though I'm not sure why I lowered my voice. Whatever was making that sound was at least 80 yards away. "Now!" We scrambled back through the door. Dominic slammed it shut, throwing the deadbolt into place with shaking hands. "What the fuck was that?" Tessa's voice was barely audible. Arden moved quickly through the cabin, checking windows, drawing curtains, his movements jerky and anxious. "Some kind of animal," I said, trying to sound reasonable. "Has to be." "What animal sounds like that?" Dominic challenged. His face was ashen under his dark beard. The wailing continued outside, punctuated by moments of silence that were somehow worse. Each time it stopped, we held our breath, wondering if it was over. And each time it started again, the fear renewed itself. "Could it be a bear?" Tessa suggested. I shook my head. "I've heard bears. They don't sound like that. Mountain lion? No, not even close." We gathered in the main room, no one wanting to be alone in a bedroom. Dominic built up the fire until it was roaring, as if the flames could somehow protect us. Tessa sat with her knees pulled to her chest, eyes fixed on the door. Arden paced, occasionally stopping to listen. I tried to think logically. We were miles from the nearest neighbor. The only road was the one we'd driven in on. There were no hospitals, no asylums, nothing that could explain a human making that sound. And if it wasn't human, we should call someone, Tessa said suddenly. "Phone's down in winter," I reminded her. "Lines get damaged in the storms, won't be fixed until spring." The reality of our isolation settled over us like a heavy blanket. No phone, no neighbors, no way to get help if we needed it. The wailing continued for hours, sometimes fading to a moan, sometimes rising to a shriek that made us cover our ears. None of us slept. We talked in whispers, speculating, trying to convince ourselves it was something ordinary, something explainable. Around 3 a.m, the sound finally stopped. We waited, tense, for it to begin again, but minutes stretched into an hour of silence. "Maybe it's gone," Arden said, his voice hoarse from the whispered conversations. "Or maybe it's moving," Dominic countered, which silenced us all again. We stayed awake until dawn broke, grey light filtering through the curtains. Birds began to sing outside, normal, familiar sounds that gradually eased the tightness in my chest. When the sun was fully up, I stood, my muscles stiff from sitting tensed all night. "I want to see," I announced. "See what?" Tessa looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Whatever was up there, maybe there'll be tracks, something to explain it." "Are you crazy?" Her voice rose. "What if it's still there?" "It's not," I said with more confidence than I felt. "Nothing makes sounds like that in daylight. Besides, whatever it was, it's gone now." Arden stood up, stretching. "I'll go with you." "No way," Dominic said. "We should all just get in the car and drive back to town." "And say what?" I challenged. "That we got scared by a strange noise. They'll laugh us out of the county." The truth was, I needed to know. The fear from the night before still clung to me, and I couldn't leave without trying to make sense of what had happened. "Fine," Dominic relented, "but Tessa and I are staying here, and if you're not back in 30 minutes, we're coming looking for you." Arden and I put on our coats and boots. I grabbed my hunting knife, not much protection, but better than nothing, and slipped it into my belt. The morning was crisp and clear. Frost covered the ground, glittering in the sunlight. Our breath clouded in front of us as we walked across the clearing toward the bluffs. "What do you think it was?" Arden asked, his voice too loud in the quiet morning. I shrugged. "Bear, maybe. Wounded or sick." but even as I said it, I knew I didn't believe it. I'd lived in these mountains all my life. I knew the sounds of every animal that called this wilderness home. What we'd heard last night was something else entirely. The climb to the bluffs was steeper than it looked. We scrambled over rocks and through patches of scrub, our progress slow but steady. Neither of us spoke much, saving our breath for the climb. As we neared the top, Arden grabbed my arm. "Marcus," he said, pointing ahead. "Look!" I followed his gaze and stopped cold. The area at the top of the bluffs, maybe 30 feet across, had been destroyed. There was no other word for it. Small trees lay on their sides, not cut but pulled out of the ground, roots and all, and tossed aside like toys. The brush had been flattened, pressed into the earth as if by some enormous weight. "Jesus," Arden whispered. We approached cautiously. The destruction was even more apparent up close. Whatever had done this was powerful, incredibly powerful. It would take a bulldozer to cause this kind of damage. "Bear?" Arden suggested weakly. I shook my head. No bear could do this. I knelt down, examining the hard ground for tracks, but found none. The earth was too frozen, too hard to take impressions. Then I noticed the smell. A strong, pungent odor hung in the air, musky, animal, but unlike anything I'd encountered before. It made my nose wrinkle and my stomach turn. "You smell that?" I asked. Arden nodded, covering his nose with his sleeve. "Like wet dog and something rotting. What could smell like that?" I stood up, suddenly eager to leave. "I don't know." We scanned the area one last time, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. Fur, tracks, droppings, but found nothing except the destroyed clearing and that persistent, unsettling smell. The walk back to the cabin was faster than the climb up. Neither of us spoke, but I could tell Arden was thinking the same thing I was. Whatever had made that sound, whatever had torn up that clearing, was something we couldn't explain, something that shouldn't exist in these woods or anywhere. Tessa and Dominic were waiting anxiously on the porch. The relief on their faces when they saw us quickly gave way to concern as they registered our expressions. "What did you find?" Dominic asked. I described the clearing, the uprooted trees, the flattened brush, the strange smell. With each detail, their faces grew more troubled. "What could do something like that?" Tessa asked. None of us answered. We didn't need to. We'd all grown up in this region, heard the stories told around campfires and at family gatherings. Stories about the creatures that supposedly roamed these mountains, massive, powerful beings that walked on two legs but weren't human. The old-timers called them Sasquatch. The rest of the world knew them as Bigfoot. I'd never believed those stories. They were just tall tales, local legends meant to scare kids and entertain tourists. But standing there, remembering that unearthly wail and the destruction we'd found, I wasn't so sure anymore. "We should go," Dominic said finally. "Pack up and get out of here." Nobody argued. We moved quickly, gathering our belongings, loading the car. I took one last look at the cabin as we pulled away, wondering if I'd ever come back. The drive to town was silent. Each of us lost in our own thoughts, processing what we'd experienced. Only when we reached the outskirts of Weaverville did Tessa speak. "We're not going to talk about this, are we?" I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Who'd believe us? "So, what do we tell people?" Arden asked. "Nothing," I said firmly. "We say nothing." And that's exactly what we did. We never spoke about that night again, not even among ourselves. We drifted apart over the years, the way friends sometimes do. But I've always suspected that night had something to do with it. Some experiences bind people together, others drive them apart, especially when they defy explanation. I never went back to that cabin. 6 months later, I told my parents I didn't have time for weekend trips anymore. They sold the place the following year. I didn't object. Sometimes, usually late at night when I'm alone, I think about that sound, that wailing that wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human. When I do, the back of my neck prickles, and I get a strange, tight feeling in my throat. It's been 30 years and still that feeling comes. I don't know what we encountered on Trinity Mountain that November night in 1964. I don't want to know. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some territories are better left unexplored. But I do know this: those mountains hold secrets. Ancient secrets that make themselves known only in the deepest part of night, when the modern world feels very far away and the primal world very close. And sometimes I swear I can still hear that wail echoing through my dreams. Story 2. I was 11 years old when I first saw it, maybe 12. The years blend together now, but the memory remains sharp as a thorn. It was 1962, or maybe 64, and I was walking down the dirt path from our house toward the spring. We lived high up in the Kings Range in Humboldt County, California, about as isolated as a family could get. Our nearest neighbors were a 2-mile hike down treacherous mountain paths. Dad had built our cabin himself after buying the land dirt cheap. Said it was good for kids to grow up with space to run wild. The spring was my place, my secret hideaway where I'd spend hours watching water bubble up from the ground, building little dams with stones, or just sitting with my feet in the cold water. That particular day was warm for early fall. Golden light filtered through the redwoods and tan oaks as I made my way down the familiar trail, humming to myself. Birds called back and forth overhead. A normal day. I rounded the bend where the path opened into a small clearing before continuing down to the spring. I glanced across the open space, and that's when I saw it. Between 2 massive trees, partially obscured by shadow, stood something impossible. A creature. Tall, taller than my father, who stood 6'2", covered in dark hair, standing upright like a man. It was watching me. I stopped dead, my lungs seized up. The thing, I could only think of it as a big ape, didn't move, just stared back at me with eyes I couldn't quite make out from that distance, but felt piercing through me all the same. Not animal eyes. There was something behind them, something thinking. I didn't run. Something told me running would be the worst thing I could do. Instead, I took 1 step backward, then another. My heart hammered so hard I felt it in my throat. I kept my eyes locked on the creature, watching for any movement. It tilted its head slightly, like it was curious about me. I continued backing away until I reached the curve in the path. Only then did I turn and run, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted uphill toward our cabin. I burst through the door, gasping for breath. Mom looked up from her sewing. Emma Sullivan, what in heaven's name? I couldn't tell her. The words wouldn't come. Instead, I mumbled something about seeing a bear. She warned me to be more careful, and that was that. I never told anyone what I'd seen, not for years. Who would believe me? I was just a kid with an overactive imagination in a place where shadows play tricks on your eyes. But I never went to the spring alone again. Our house burned down in 1967. An electrical fire, they said, though the irony wasn't lost on Dad, who'd wired the place himself. We lost everything and moved to Eureka. I was 16 then, ready for city life, ready to put the mountains behind me. It was 1970 when I finally told someone. My sister Diana and I were sitting on her apartment balcony, sharing a cigarette after dinner. We'd both grown up, me at 19, her at 22. Diana had her own place now, worked as a secretary at the lumber mill office. We were talking about the old house, reminiscing about childhood memories. "Remember the spring?" I asked. Diana nodded, taking a drag. "Used to spend whole days there." "Did you ever—" I hesitated, then pushed forward. "Did you ever see anything strange up there? In the woods?" Diana's hand froze halfway to her mouth. The cigarette trembled between her fingers. "What kind of strange?" Her voice had gone flat. So I told her about the creature I'd seen watching me from across the clearing, about how big it was, how it stood like a man, but wasn't a man, how I'd never told anyone because I was scared they'd think I was crazy. Diana started crying. Not small tears, but deep, racking sobs that bent her double. "Diana!" I reached for her, alarmed. "What's wrong?" She looked up at me, mascara running down her cheeks. "I saw it too, Em, at the spring." My blood went cold. Between sobs, Diana told me her story. She'd been 13, sitting on a fallen log by the spring, dangling her feet in the water. She'd felt something, a presence, and looked up to find the creature perched on a log above her, looking down. She'd screamed and run all the way back to the house, but like me, she'd never told anyone. She'd convinced herself it was her imagination. We sat in silence after that, the weight of our shared secret hanging between us. All those years, we'd both carried the same terror and never spoken of it. "What do you think it was?" Diana finally asked. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But it was real. We both saw it." 2 years later, in 1972, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I moved back to our family's property. The foundation of the house remained, along with the old stone chimney. Dad still owned the land but had no interest in rebuilding. He signed it over to me without argument. "Nothing up there but memories and mosquitoes," he'd said. I was 21 with a 2-year-old son, Jasper. His father wasn't in the picture. I'd convinced myself that the mountains would be good for Jasper. Clean air, space to run, the same freedom I'd had as a child. I told myself that what Diana and I had seen was just a fluke, a strange animal passing through, nothing to fear in broad daylight. We lived in a trailer at first, while I cleared the old foundation. Slowly, I rebuilt. Not as big as the original house, just a one-room cabin with a loft for sleeping. No electricity, just propane for the stove and lanterns for light. The nearest phone was at Mac Thornton's place, 2 miles down the mountain. Jasper thrived. He toddled around the clearing in overalls, collecting rocks and chasing butterflies. I kept him close, though, never let him wander toward the spring alone. Some fears run too deep to ignore completely. For months it was good, hard work, simple living. Every evening I'd build a fire in a ring of stones outside the cabin. Jasper and I would eat dinner there, listening to the chorus of birds that filled the hillside. Robins, thrushes, chickadees, jays, a constant symphony that continued until dusk fell and the night creatures took over. Then came that October evening. The day had been ordinary. I'd spent the morning washing clothes in a tub, hanging them on the line, stretching from the cabin to a nearby oak. Jasper had helped, splashing in the rinse water. After his nap, we'd walk down to the garden I'd planted in a sunny spot, harvesting the last of the season's tomatoes and some late squash. As the sun began to set, I built our usual fire and set about making dinner. Beans with the fresh vegetables and cornbread cooked in a cast-iron skillet. Jasper played with wooden blocks on a blanket nearby. I noticed the silence gradually, first as a vague unease, then with growing alarm as I realized what was missing. The birds had stopped singing, not just quieted, stopped completely. No sound at all came from the surrounding forest. No chickadees, no jays, no nuthatches, even the ever-present ravens were silent. I'd lived in these mountains most of my life. I'd never heard such silence. The fire crackled. Jasper babbled to himself, knocking his blocks together. But beyond our little circle of light, nothing. Just dead, watching silence. I stood up slowly, wiping my hands on my jeans. The hair on my arms stood up. "Jasper," I called softly, "come to Mama." He looked up, frowning at my tone. "Blocks. Bring a block with you, baby. Come here now." As he toddled over, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched, not just by one pair of eyes, but many. Something out there in the darkening woods was focusing its attention on us. I picked Jasper up, holding him tight against my chest. He squirmed, still clutching his wooden block. "Dinner, Mama?" "We're going to go on a little adventure," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the fear crawling up my spine. "We're going to visit Mr. Thornton." I didn't wait to pack properly, didn't stop to consider options. Pure instinct drove me. I grabbed a flashlight, stuffed Jasper's blanket and a few diapers into a knapsack, and slung it over my shoulder. My hand shook as I reached for the rifle leaning by the door, but I left it behind. I couldn't carry Jasper, the bag, and shoot accurately in the dark. As we stepped away from the fire's light, the silence pressed in harder. No crickets chirped, no frogs called from the creek, nothing rustled in the underbrush. Just unnatural, suffocating silence. I pointed my flashlight at the path and started walking, not running, though every nerve screamed at me to flee. Running would be dangerous on the steep, rocky trail. More importantly, something told me running would trigger whatever watched from the shadows. Jasper sensed my fear and stayed quiet, his little arms wrapped tight around my neck. The flashlight beam bounced ahead of us, carving a narrow tunnel of light through the absolute darkness. The trail to Thornton's was familiar, but in the dark every shadow seemed menacing, every tree trunk a potential hiding place. We were about a quarter-mile down when I heard it. A cracking sound from the forest to our left. A heavy footstep on dry branches, then another parallel to us but deeper in the woods. I picked up my pace, heart pounding. The footsteps continued, keeping time with us, but staying just out of sight. When I slowed, they slowed. When I hurried, they hurried. Something was following us. "Mama," Jasper whispered, his mouth close to my ear. "Monster in trees." I didn't ask what he meant, didn't want to know what his innocent eyes might have spotted that mine had missed. "It's just the wind," I lied, hitching him higher on my hip. My arms burned with the effort of carrying him, but I didn't dare set him down. The path steepened, winding down the mountainside. The footsteps continued, sometimes from the left, sometimes from the right. Once I heard what sounded like breathing, heavy and not quite human, from just behind a thick stand of manzanita. I sang to Jasper quietly, as much to calm myself as him. Old folk songs my mother had sung to me. Anything to break the unnatural silence and distract from the sounds of pursuit. It took us nearly 2 hours to reach Thornton's place, a trip that normally took 45 minutes in daylight. By the time his porch light came into view, my arms were numb and my legs shook with exhaustion and fear. The footsteps had stopped 100 yards back, at the edge of Thornton's cleared land. I'll never forget Mac Thornton's face when he opened his door and found us standing there, me wild-eyed and trembling, Jasper half asleep on my shoulder. "Good Lord, Emma, what happened?" He ushered us inside, warm light spilling over us. I couldn't explain. Not really. What would I say? That the birds stopped singing, that I felt watched, that something followed us through the dark. "Thought I heard some kind of animal prowling around the cabin," I said instead. "Got spooked with Jasper there. Sorry to bother you so late." Mac didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes. But he didn't press, just made up the spare bed and fixed me a cup of hot tea laced with whiskey. "You're staying the night," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded gratefully. I never went back to live in that cabin, returned once in daylight with Mac and his son to collect our clothes and the few valuables I couldn't bear to leave behind. The silence still hung over the place, though a few birds called half-heartedly from distant trees. The land felt different, wrong, like something had claimed it. That was 50 years ago now. I'm an old woman living in Eureka again, in a small house with a view of the bay. Jasper lives in Seattle with his family. Diana passed 10 years back. Sometimes I drive out to the foot of the mountains and look up toward where our property sits, now overgrown and wild. I never go farther than the main road. People around here talk about Bigfoot sightings. They sell tacky souvenirs to tourists and tell campfire stories. They treat it like folklore, a fun mystery. They don't know. They don't understand that the forests hide something ancient and watchful, something that can steal the voices from the birds and follow you through the darkness, something that can look into your eyes across a sunlit clearing and let you see the intelligence behind its gaze. something that knows your fear and remembers your face, even decades later. I dream about it sometimes, about those eyes watching me across the clearing when I was 11, about the footsteps following us through the dark. In my dreams, I always turn around to look directly at what pursues us, but I always wake up before I see it. Maybe that's mercy. Some things once seen can never be unseen. They follow you through the years, patient and persistent as the creature that claimed our mountain, waiting for you to return to the silence. Bamin. Story 3. Gim. I jerked awake, my ears picking up a sound that didn't belong. The summer of '65 had been good to us so far. Me, Butch, Dale, Roy, and Eddie had been fixing up our secret cabin since we'd discovered it 3 summers back. Tonight was meant to be just another night in our hideaway, 3 miles deep in the Humboldt forest near Myers Flat. But that sound, a low, rhythmic huffing, wasn't right. I lay still on my sleeping bag, listening hard. The cabin was pitch black except for a sliver of moonlight cutting through the single window. The huffing continued, definitely coming from outside. Not an animal I recognized, and I'd been hunting these woods since I was 10. "Dale," I whispered, reaching over to shake my friend's shoulder. "Wake up!" Dale stirred, mumbling something about school. "Shut up and listen," I hissed. He went quiet. The huffing continued, now accompanied by heavy footsteps circling the cabin. Dale's eyes widened in the darkness. "What is that?" he whispered. "Don't know," I answered, "but it's big." We listened as whatever it was continued its methodical path around our cabin. The footsteps were heavy, making the ground vibrate slightly with each step. When it reached the back wall, we heard something new. Scratching, then what sounded like fingers or claws probing at the bottom of the cabin wall. "Wake the others," I said. Dale scrambled over to Roy while I shook Eddie awake. Butch was already sitting up, his hand reaching for the .22 rifle he'd brought along, despite his dad telling him not to. "Something's outside," I explained in a hushed voice. "Big, walking around the cabin." "Probably a bear," Eddie suggested, but his voice trembled. "Bears don't circle like that," Butch replied. "They'd be making more noise too." The creature had reached the far corner now. We could hear it digging at the ground near the foundation, then a splintering sound as it began to pry at the bottom boards of the cabin. "It's trying to get in," Roy whispered. We huddled together in the center of the single room, away from the walls. The thing outside moved methodically, testing different spots along the wall. Wood creaked under pressure. One of the boards gave a sharp crack. "The boards are rotted down there," Dale said. "We never fixed those." I remembered our repair work over the past summers. We'd reinforced the roof, fixed the door, replaced some of the worst wall planks, but we hadn't bothered with the bottom edge boards that disappeared into the dirt. Stupid, stupid oversight. The creature continued working its way around, stopping occasionally to dig or pry. We sat frozen, barely breathing. My watch read 2:17 a.m. Then the footsteps moved toward the front of the cabin. The small porch creaked under heavy weight. Something large pressed against the door. Our door that we'd proudly repaired and rehung. It was only about 5 feet high, an old logging cabin built in the 30s, with smaller framed men in mind. The door handle jiggled. "It's trying the door," Eddie whispered unnecessarily. Butch stood up, gripping his rifle. "We need to see what it is." "Are you crazy?" Roy hissed. "If it gets in anyway, we're trapped," Butch reasoned. "Better to face it now." I didn't agree with his logic, but Butch was already moving toward the door, .22 in hand. He positioned himself about 6 feet back, rifle raised. "Jackson," he said, voice steady despite everything. "Open the door." "What?" "No," I protested. "Just crack it," he insisted. "I need to see what we're dealing with." The thing outside pushed against the door again, harder this time. The old hinges groaned. "It's coming in anyway," Butch said. "Do it now." Heart hammering in my chest, I crawled forward. The other three boys pressed themselves against the back wall. I reached the door, feeling the vibration as the creature pushed against it from the other side. My hand shook as I reached for the latch. With one quick movement, I flipped it open and pushed the door about 6 inches outward, then scrambled back to where Butch stood aiming. The night beyond was dark, but not dark enough to hide what filled the doorframe. Massive, hairy legs stood there. Not bear legs, not human legs, but something in between. They were covered in thick, dark hair or fur. I couldn't see above the knees because of the door's height, but what I could see was enough to freeze my blood. Butch didn't hesitate. The .22 cracked loudly in the small cabin. The response was immediate and terrifying. A scream ripped through the night, high-pitched yet guttural, like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. The creature spun away from the door, the porch shaking under its weight. Then came 3 distinct thuds as it leaped away from the cabin. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence fell over the forest. No insects chirping, no nightbirds calling. Nothing. "Did you hit it?" Dale whispered after what felt like minutes. "Think so," Butch replied, his voice shaking now that the moment had passed. "Aimed for the leg." "What the hell was that?" Roy asked. "Not a bear," Eddie said. "Not a person either." I crawled forward and pushed the door shut, throwing the latch back into place. We gathered in the center of the room again, sitting in a tight circle with our backs to each other, facing outward. No one suggested going back to sleep. Butch kept the rifle across his knees. "Anyone got a watch with a light?" Dale asked. I pressed the button on mine. 2:23 a.m. 4.5 hours till sunrise, Butch calculated. Those were the longest 4.5 hours of my life. We sat there jumping at every sound, the settling of the cabin, the return of a few brave insects chirping outside, the occasional distant hoot of an owl. But the creature didn't return. At the first hint of grey light through the window, we were still sitting in our circle, stiff and exhausted. "Let's check outside," Butch said, standing up with a groan. "All of us," Roy insisted. "Nobody goes alone." We grabbed our flashlights even though dawn was breaking and ventured out together. The morning air felt cool against my clammy skin. Birds were starting to sing in the trees, the normal forest sounds returning. The porch showed the first evidence. Deep gouges marked the wood where something had stood, like the creature had dug its toes or claws in. We moved carefully around the perimeter of the cabin, finding disturbed earth where it had been digging at the foundation. "Over here," called Dale, who'd ventured about 15 feet from the porch. "Look at this." We gathered around where he pointed. The ground was torn up in a circular pattern, like something had pivoted rapidly. Beyond that were 3 distinct depressions in the soft forest floor, each about the size of a dinner plate, spaced about 6 feet apart. "It jumped," Eddie said. 3 strides and it was gone. 6-foot strides, Roy added, his voice hollow. Butch knelt down, examining the torn-up area. "No blood," he said, sounding disappointed. "I know I hit it." "Maybe you just grazed it," I suggested. "Or maybe bullets don't hurt it," Dale whispered. We all looked at him. "Don't say that," Eddie snapped. "Don't even think it." We followed the 3 clear footprints until they disappeared where the ground became harder and covered with pine needles. There was no trail to follow after that, though we searched for nearly an hour. "We should pack up," Butch finally said. "Head back to town." No one argued. We returned to the cabin and gathered our things in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I kept replaying the image of those hairy legs in the doorway, too big to be human, too straight to be bear. By 7:30 a.m., we had our packs ready and were standing outside the cabin. It looked innocent in the morning light, just an old logger's shack that we'd fixed up over 3 summers. Our hideaway. "Maybe it was just a bear," Eddie said, not sounding convinced. "Bears don't scream like that," Roy replied. "And they don't have legs like what we saw." "Bigfoot," Dale said quietly. That's what it was. We'd all heard the stories, of course. Humboldt County, Had its share of Bigfoot sightings over the years. I'd always thought they were just tall tales told by loggers and hunters. But now, "Let's go," Butch said, adjusting his pack. "Don't look back." But I did look back, one last time, as we started down the trail toward town. The cabin sat there in its small clearing, morning sunlight slanting through the trees to touch its weathered walls. Our 3 summers of work, our secret place, now violated by something from the darkness. None of us spoke much on the hike back. The normal forest sounds surrounded us, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the wind in the pines. But every noise made us flinch. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide something watching us. When we finally reached the road where Dale's older brother would pick us up, Butch stopped us. "We don't tell anyone the details," he said firmly. "They'll think we're crazy or lying." "My parents will want to know why we're back early," Eddie pointed out. "Tell them we heard a bear and got spooked," Butch replied. "That's all." We nodded in agreement, creating our cover story as we waited for our ride. But we all knew what we had seen, what we had heard, what had tried to break into our cabin. That was 42 years ago now. I'm 57 years old, with kids of my own, grown and gone. Butch passed away last year, heart attack while fishing the Eel River. Dale moved to Oregon, Roy to Southern California. Eddie stayed in Humboldt County like me, though we don't see each other much. But every few years, we'd manage to get together, all 5 of us, until Butch died. We'd have a few beers, catch up on life, families, jobs. And inevitably, after the 2nd or 3rd beer, one of us would say, "Remember that night at the cabin?" And we'd fall silent, then speak in hushed tones about what we'd experienced, the huffing sounds, the methodical testing of our cabin's weaknesses, those massive hairy legs in the doorway, the inhuman scream when Butch fired. None of us ever went back to that cabin. None of us ever spent another night in those woods. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed and the house is quiet, I hear that huffing sound again in my memory. And I wonder if it's still out there in the dense forests near Myers Flat, searching for a way in. Story 4. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it a rancid smell that made my stomach turn. I froze in place, flashlight beam trembling across the darkened tree line. Behind me, 25 children huddled closer to our campfire, their excited chatter from earlier now reduced to frightened whispers. Another crash echoed from the ridge above us, followed by tumbling rocks. Something was up there, something big. My name's Nathan Wilcox. I'm 22 years old, and until yesterday, my biggest concern as head counselor at Camp Siskiyou was making sure none of the kids got poison oak. Now I'm wondering if we'll make it through the night. It started yesterday afternoon, July 15th, 1966, a date I'll never forget. We'd set out around noon from the main camp with 25 kids between ages 9 and 12. There were 4 of us counselors, me, Tim Rader, Larry Blackwood, and Sonny Martinez. Tim and I had grown up together in Redding. Larry was from Oregon, quiet but reliable. Sonny was a biology student at Berkeley, smart as a whip and good with the kids. The hike to East Boulder Lake wasn't particularly challenging. About 4 miles of gentle uphill climbing through pine forest before a steeper ascent to the ridge. We'd done it plenty of times before. The kids were in high spirits, pointing out lizards and interesting rocks, playing those endless walking games they come up with. At about 3:30 p.m., we reached the clearing just below the ridge. The lake was visible below us, maybe 3/4 of a mile away. I was checking the map when I heard the first screams. "Look! Look! It's a bear!" Billy Cochran was pointing toward the northeast slope. I snapped my head up, immediately counting heads and preparing to gather the children, but Tim grabbed my arm hard. "That is no bear," he muttered. The thing stood not 50 feet away, at our same elevation on the steep slope. It was leaning against the canyon wall with its left arm, swinging its right arm back and forth like it was trying to keep its balance. Its head bobbed rhythmically as it watched us. I've seen plenty of bears in these mountains. Black bears mostly, with the occasional brown. This wasn't either. It stood nearly 6 feet tall, covered in long reddish-brown fur. But the face, that's what got me. Large and flat, with round yellow eyes that seemed to glow even in the afternoon sunlight. "Everyone stay together," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Nobody move." The children, surprisingly, weren't panicking. Some looked scared, but most seemed curious, excited even. "What is it?" whispered Jenny Mills, one of the younger girls. Sunny had her hand over her mouth. "Look at the chest," she said to me quietly. "It's hairless, and those are nipples. I think it's female." She was right. The creature's chest was lighter colored, and I could make out what appeared to be large, protruding nipples. For what felt like forever, but was probably just over a minute, the creature observed us. We observed it right back. Then, without warning, it spun around and ran away from us, sending a landslide of loose rock tumbling down into the valley. When it reached the ridge, it turned back for one final look at our group before disappearing over the edge. The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. Then all 25 kids started talking at once. "Did you see that? Was that Bigfoot? It looked at me, it looked right at me." I gathered the counselors quickly. "What do we do?" Larry asked, his voice tight. "Head back to camp." I checked my watch. It was already mid-afternoon. Going back now would mean hiking in the dark, which seemed more dangerous than continuing. "I think we should go onto the lake," I said. "We're almost there, and we've got safety in numbers." Tim nodded. "I agree. Whatever that was, it ran away from us." It seemed more scared than aggressive. Sunny was still staring at the ridge. "That was not a bear," she said firmly. "The proportions were all wrong. The gait was bipedal, smooth. The face structure. We'll figure it out later," I said. "Right now, let's get to the lake and set up camp before dark." We reorganized the group. Tim took the lead. I stayed in the middle with most of the children, and Larry and Sunny brought up the rear. As we continued down toward East Boulder Lake, I noticed something odd. While we counselors were shaken, the kids seemed energized. They chatted excitedly about Bigfoot and Sasquatch, trading stories they'd heard from older siblings or read in magazines. We reached the lake by 4:45 p.m. and immediately set about making camp. The lake site had a large clearing that could accommodate our group, with a fire pit already established from previous campers. We assigned the kids to collect firewood, set up tents, and prepare dinner. Keeping them busy seemed like the best approach. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in deep orange and purple, I found myself constantly scanning the ridgeline. Whatever we had seen, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still up there watching us. "You okay?" Sunny appeared at my side, handing me a cup of instant coffee. "Yeah," I lied, "just being cautious." "I've read about Bigfoot sightings," she said, keeping her voice low so the kids wouldn't hear. "But I never believed them. Until today." "You really think that's what it was?" "I don't know what else it could be. The dimensions, the movement." She shook her head. "It wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal native to these mountains." By 7 o'clock, darkness had fallen completely. We had a good fire going, and the kids were roasting marshmallows, still buzzing about our encounter. I was just starting to relax when the smell hit me. It was powerful, like a skunk, but mixed with something else. Musk, urine, decay. It rolled over our campsite in waves, getting stronger with each gust of wind. The excited chatter around the fire dropped to whispers. I exchanged glances with Tim, who had clearly noticed it too. "Everyone stay close to the fire," I said, trying to sound calm. That's when we heard it, the sound of rocks sliding down the ridge in multiple locations. Not the natural tumble of an occasional loose stone, but the deliberate displacement caused by something large moving up there. "Nathan," Larry pointed toward the north end of the lake. A dim green light about the size of a grapefruit hovered about 6 feet off the ground. As I watched, it moved slowly, deliberately, along the shoreline. The smell intensified. "What is that?" Tim whispered. Before I could answer, a snap echoed from the trees, barely 10 yards from our campsite. Not a small twig, but the sharp crack of a substantial branch breaking under significant weight. The children pressed closer to the fire, some of them starting to cry now. I pulled out my flashlight, aiming it toward the sound. That's when I saw it. A massive shadow figure, easily 8 feet tall, taking several deliberate strides through a gap in the trees. The beam of my flashlight caught only its outline, broader than any human, with long arms that hung almost to its knees. "Oh my God," Sonny breathed. More movement caught my eye. Not just one figure, but several dark forms moving around the perimeter of our camp. The smell became almost unbearable. "Everyone back to back," I ordered, gathering the children into a tight circle around the fire. Counselors, flashlights out, facing outward. For the next 2 hours we maintained this position. The dark forms never approached the fire directly, but they didn't leave either. They circled us, occasionally making noises, not quite growls, not quite words, but something in between. Low, rumbling vocalizations that seemed to communicate between them. Around midnight, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, Bobby Jennings, an 11-year-old boy, doubled over in pain. "My stomach," he groaned. "It really hurts." Sonny examined him quickly. "Lower right quadrant pain," she said. "Could be appendicitis." We needed help, and fast. If Bobby's appendix burst out here, he could die. "Tim, Larry," I said, making a quick decision. "You two need to hike back to the main camp for help. Bring back the camp director and medical supplies." "You want us to go now?" Larry looked terrified, staring out into the darkness. "With those things out there?" "Bobby needs help," I said firmly. "Sonny and I will stay with the kids. Take the trail flares and make as much noise as you can." They didn't like it, but they went. We watched their flashlights bobbing away up the trail, Tim occasionally firing off a flare that briefly illuminated the forest in harsh red light. As soon as they disappeared from view, something strange happened. The smell vanished. The unsettling noises stopped. An unnatural stillness settled over our campsite. "They're gone," whispered Jenny. "Or they're waiting," I responded, not taking any chances. "Everyone stay alert." We kept the fire burning high all night. Bobby's pain seemed to stabilize, not worse but not better either. None of us slept. Every cracking twig, every rustle of leaves had us jumping. But the dark figures didn't return. As dawn broke over the mountains, I finally allowed myself to breathe. We'd made it through the night. Bobby was pale but conscious, and the other children were exhausted but safe. Around 9:30 a.m., we heard voices calling from the trail. Tim and Larry had returned with Camp Director Hank Johnson, the camp nurse, and 2 forest rangers. They carried a stretcher for Bobby. While the nurse examined Bobby, Director Johnson pulled me aside. "Tim and Larry told me what happened," he said, his face grave, "about what you all saw." "It wasn't a bear, sir," I said firmly. "None of us have ever seen anything like it." Johnson ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I need to talk to everyone, separately." Over the next hour, he interviewed every counselor and child. I don't know what the others told him, but when he came back to me, his expression had changed. "Look, Nathan," he said, speaking quietly so others wouldn't hear. "I've been running this camp for 15 years. I know these mountains. Sometimes people see things in the wilderness. The mind plays tricks." "All of us saw the same thing," I insisted. "And what about the smell, the noises, the green light?" He held up his hand. "I'm not saying nothing happened. Clearly something strange occurred last night, but we need to be measured in how we discuss this." "What does that mean?" "It means," he said carefully, "that I need you and the other counselors to acknowledge the possibility that what you saw could have been bears. Unusual bears, perhaps, but still bears. I started to protest, but he cut me off. Think about the camp, Nathan. If word gets out that we led 25 children into a Bigfoot encounter, parents will pull their kids out. We'll be shut down. He looked me in the eye. And no one would believe you anyway. You know that. He was right about that last part, at least. Who would believe that we'd encountered not just one, but an entire family of creatures that weren't supposed to exist? We packed up camp quickly. Bobby was loaded onto the stretcher. Later, we'd learn it was just a severe case of gastroenteritis, not appendicitis, and we made our way back to the main camp. The children were sworn to secrecy, though I doubted that would last once they got home. Director Johnson cancelled all further excursions to East Boulder Lake for the remainder of the summer. He cited trail maintenance issues as the official reason. That night, after the children were finally asleep, the four of us counselors met by the main lodge to talk. "What do you think they were?" Larry asked, his voice still shaky. "Bigfoot," Sonny said without hesitation. "A family group, I'd guess. The one we saw in the daylight was probably an adolescent or female. The larger forms at night were adult males." "But why were they interested in us?" Tim wondered. I had been thinking about that all day. "The kids," I said. "I think they were curious about the children." "But they didn't hurt anyone," Sonny pointed out. "They could have easily. We were completely vulnerable out there." She was right. Whatever had surrounded our camp that night could have attacked at any time, but they hadn't. They'd watched, communicated among themselves, and kept their distance. "I don't think they meant us any harm," I said slowly. "I think they were just curious, like we were about them." The four of us made a pact that night. We'd respect Director Johnson's wishes and not spread wild stories that might damage the camp. But we also wouldn't deny what we'd seen, not to each other at least. It's been a week since our trip to East Boulder Lake. The camp session ends tomorrow, and the children will return to their homes across California and Oregon. They'll tell their parents stories about swimming and hiking and making new friends. And maybe, when the lights are out and they're alone with their siblings or their best friends, they'll whisper about the creatures we saw in the mountains. As for me, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. These mountains have been here long before us, and they'll be here long after we're gone. And in the remote corners, in the places humans rarely tread, I now know we're not alone. The creatures at East Boulder Lake let us go. They watched over us through the night and then melted away with the coming dawn. I don't know if we'll ever see them again, but I do know this. Next time I'm hiking in these mountains, I'll be looking over my shoulder. And if I catch that distinctive smell on the wind, I'll turn around and head home. Some mysteries are better left undisturbed. Story 5. The moment before I saw it, I felt something was wrong. The forest went quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a summer afternoon, but the tense silence of prey sensing a predator. I should have listened to that silence. My name is Mason Andrews. What happened to me and my friends in the San Bernardino forest in 1966 changed us forever. I've kept this story close for decades, but the nightmares haven't stopped and the scars haven't faded. Maybe telling it will help, maybe not, but it's time. It was July 1966, hot as hell even in the mountains. Me, Tyler Hoffman, Caleb Peterson, and Dylan Mitchell had just finished our junior year at Pine Ridge High. We were 17, invincible, and stupid, the perfect combination for trouble. Tyler had gotten his dad's pickup truck for the weekend, and we had loaded it with enough gear and beer for 2 nights in the woods. "You guys hear about Billy Thornton's cousin?" Caleb asked, as we bounced along the logging road toward our campsite. "Says he saw something weird out here last month. Like a giant monkey or something." "Bullshit," Tyler laughed, swerving to hit a pothole on purpose, making us all jump. "Billy's cousin is a drunk who sees pink elephants too." "My grandpa used to talk about the forest people," Dylan said quietly from the back. "Said the old-timers wouldn't come up here after dark." I turned around to look at Dylan. Forest people? You mean like Indians? Nah, Dylan shook his head. Something else. Something that wasn't quite human. Tyler honked the horn twice, making us all jump. You girls gonna tell ghost stories all day, or are we gonna set up camp and crack open those beers? We arrived at the clearing around noon. It was a good spot. Flat ground for the tents, a circle of stones for a fire pit left by previous campers, and a small creek about 50 yards away. The forest stretched in every direction, thick pines and oaks creating a canopy that dappled the ground with patches of sunlight. We spent that first day setting up camp, drinking beer, and exploring the immediate area. Nothing unusual happened. Just 4 teenage boys acting like idiots, shooting at cans with Dylan's BB gun and talking about Susie Parker's breasts. That night, we sat around the fire, swapping stories and planning our senior year. It was after midnight when we crawled into our tents, me and Tyler in one, Caleb and Dylan in the other. The next morning, we woke to clear skies and decided to explore deeper into the woods. We hiked for a couple hours, finding a small waterfall where we stopped to eat the sandwiches we'd packed. Everything felt normal, safe. It was late afternoon when we headed back to camp. About a quarter mile from our site, Tyler said, "We should collect firewood on the way, split up and meet back at camp in 30 minutes." We agreed and headed in different directions. I walked north, picking up fallen branches and snapping off dead limbs from trees. The forest was thicker here, the ground covered in pine needles that muffled my footsteps. I remember checking my watch. 4:17 p.m. That detail stuck with me because everything changed exactly 1 minute later. I heard rustling behind a cluster of trees about 20 yards ahead. The sound was too deliberate for wind, too heavy for a squirrel or bird. "Very funny, Ty," I called out, thinking he was trying to scare me. "I can hear you, man." The rustling stopped. Complete silence followed. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A low, rumbling growl that started soft and grew into something that vibrated the air around me. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a mountain lion. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. My body went cold. I dropped the firewood. "Tyler," my voice cracked. "Caleb, this isn't funny, guys." No answer except another growl. Closer now, I took a step backward, my heel catching on a root. That's when it emerged from behind the trees. First, I saw the arm, massive, covered in dark brown matted fur, with a hand that looked almost human but wrong, the fingers too long, the nails black and curved like claws. Then the head appeared, a sloped forehead, deep-set eyes beneath heavy brows, a wide nose, and a mouth pulled back in what might have been a snarl or a grin. It stood upright, 6, maybe 7 feet tall. Its body was barrel-chested, powerful. The fur was thicker around its shoulders and thinner on its chest, where I could see skin the color of a bruise underneath. For 3 heartbeats we stared at each other. Its eyes were amber, almost yellow in the forest light, and they held something I wasn't prepared for. Intelligence, recognition. This wasn't an animal looking at me, it was something else. I should have run immediately, but shock kept me rooted. The creature tilted its head, studying me with those terrible knowing eyes. Then it took a step forward, moving with a fluid grace that defied its size. That broke my trance. I turned and ran. I made it 2 steps before I felt something snag my shirt. Pain exploded across my back, hot, sharp lines of fire that told me its claws had found flesh. I screamed and lurched forward, breaking free. I ran blind through the forest, branches whipping my face, my feet catching on roots and stones. Behind me, the creature howled, a sound that started like a man's shout and ended like a wolf's cry. The forest seemed to shake with it. I don't know how long I ran or in what direction. My lungs burned, my back was wet with what I knew was blood, and terror pushed me forward when my legs wanted to give out. I slammed into something solid, a person. Hands grabbed my shoulders. I fought wildly until I heard Tyler's voice. "Mason! What the fuck, man? What happened?" I couldn't speak, could only point behind me, trying to catch my breath. Tyler's eyes widened as he looked at me, or rather, at my back. "Jesus Christ, Mason, you're bleeding!" Caleb and Dylan appeared from between the trees, drawn by the commotion. Their faces showed matching expressions of shock. "Something attacked me," I finally managed to say. "It wasn't a bear. It stood up. It had hands." "You're not making sense," Caleb said, but his voice shook. "Let's get back to camp and look at your back." Tyler put his arm around me, supporting my weight. We started walking, me babbling about the creature, them exchanging worried glances over my head. We were maybe 50 yards from our campsite when Dylan stopped suddenly, grabbing Tyler's arm. "Look," he whispered, pointing to our right. Between the trees, partially hidden by shadows, stood a dark figure. It was too far away to make out details, but I knew what it was. It stood motionless, watching us. "Run," I said, my voice surprisingly calm given the thunder of my heart. "Run now." We ran. We reached the campsite and didn't stop to grab anything except the truck keys from Tyler's tent. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see it burst from the trees. Tyler's truck was parked a quarter-mile down the logging road. We piled in, Tyler fumbling with the keys, the engine turning over once, twice before catching. As we pulled away, dust billowing behind us, Caleb pointed out the window. "There, at the edge of the clearing." We all saw it then. The creature, standing at the forest line, watching our truck bounce down the road. Even at that distance, I could feel those eyes on me. Then the trees obscured it, and it was gone. Nobody spoke for the first 10 minutes of the drive. Then Dylan said, "Your back looks bad, Mason." I reached around, feeling the torn fabric of my shirt, the warm wetness of blood. The pain, which adrenaline had masked, was starting to throb with each heartbeat. "What the hell was that thing?" Caleb asked. Nobody answered. We drove straight to the sheriff's station in Pine Ridge. Sheriff Dawson was a big man with a grey crew cut and skeptical eyes. He listened to our story, his expression growing more dubious with each sentence. "Boys," he said when I finished, "there ain't no monsters in these woods. Been patrolling them for 20 years. "Look at his back," Tyler insisted. Reluctantly, the sheriff had me remove my shirt. The claw marks were unmistakable, 4 parallel gashes from my right shoulder blade to the middle of my back. They weren't deep enough to need stitches, but they were clearly not from a branch or a fall. "Probably a bear," Sheriff Dawson said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Mountain lion, maybe, though they don't usually attack unless provoked." "It wasn't a bear," I said firmly. "It stood upright. It had hands, eyes like a person." The sheriff sighed. "Son, you were scared. Mind plays tricks when you're scared." In the end, he wrote up a report listing it as a probable bear encounter, gave me some antiseptic and bandages, and called my parents. The guys backed up my story, but I could tell the sheriff thought we were either lying or confused. My parents arrived 30 minutes later, my mom fussing over my back, my dad talking in low tones with the sheriff. I heard phrases like overactive imagination and boys will be boys. That night, lying on my stomach in bed as my back throbbed, I heard my parents discussing whether to take me to a doctor in the morning. My mom thought the cuts might get infected. My dad thought I'd be fine. Neither of them believed what had attacked me. The next day, the story had already spread through Pine Ridge. At the drugstore where my mom took me to get more bandages, Mrs. Henderson at the counter asked in a hushed voice if it was true I'd been attacked by Bigfoot. It wasn't Bigfoot, I told her, though I had no idea what it actually was. By Monday, when we returned to our summer jobs, the whole town had versions of the story. Some people avoided me, others wanted all the gory details. Most just laughed it off as 4 teenagers who got drunk in the woods and panicked at shadows. But I knew what I'd seen, and so did Tyler, Caleb, and Dylan. We met that night at the water tower, our usual hangout spot. Dylan brought a library book about cryptozoology, flipping through pages of blurry photos and drawings. "Look," he said, pointing to an illustration labeled North American Sasquatch. "Is this what you saw?" I studied the picture. There were similarities. The height, the fur, the general shape. But it wasn't quite right. "No," I said. "The one I saw, its face was different, more, I don't know. Its eyes were different." "Different how?" Caleb pressed. I struggled to explain. "Like it knew me, like it was thinking about me, not just seeing me." We sat in silence for a while. Then Tyler spoke up. "My uncle works for the Forest Service. He says there have been reports over the years. Hikers going missing, strange noises at night. They don't publicize it because they don't want to scare off tourists." "So what do we do?" Dylan asked. "Nothing," I said. "Nobody believes us anyway." We made a pact that night, the four of us. We would never go back to those woods, and we wouldn't talk about what happened to anyone else. What was the point? We'd be labeled as liars or crazy. But privately, I couldn't let it go. I started researching, reading everything I could find about unexplained creatures, about the history of the San Bernardino mountains. I learned that the local Native American tribes had stories about forest guardians, tall, powerful beings that protected the wilderness from trespassers. I learned about miners in the 1800s who abandoned rich claims because of wild men who stalked their camps at night. The claw marks on my back healed into 4 pale scars. I told girls they were from a mountain lion attack, which made for a good story at parties, but every night when I saw them in the mirror, I remembered those amber eyes. Senior year came and went. We graduated. Tyler went to work for his dad's construction company. Caleb joined the army and shipped out to Vietnam. Dylan moved to San Francisco to attend college. I stayed in Pine Ridge, taking classes at the community college and working at the hardware store. Life moved on, but I never forgot. In 1972, 6 years after our encounter, a hiking party of 5 went missing in the same area where we had camped. They found the hikers' gear 3 days later, scattered and torn apart. The hikers themselves were never found. The official explanation was a bear attack, though no remains were ever recovered. I read about it in the newspaper and felt a cold certainty in my gut. I called Tyler that night. "Did you see?" I asked when he answered. "Yeah," he said. "You think it was?" "I know it was." We didn't say more. What could we say? Over the decades, there were other incidents. Not many, but enough to form a pattern if you were looking for one. Most were explained away as animal attacks or people getting lost. A few remained mysteries. I never went back to those woods. I built a life in Pine Ridge, married my high school sweetheart Laura, had 2 kids, took over the hardware store when the owner retired. I became what people around here call a solid citizen. The wild teenager who claimed to see monsters became a respectable businessman who sponsored little league teams and served on the town council. But I never forgot. And on summer nights, when the wind blows a certain way, I still wake up from dreams of running through the forest, a howl echoing behind me, the feeling of eyes, intelligent, knowing eyes, watching from the darkness. The scars on my back have faded to thin silver lines, barely visible now, but sometimes when I'm alone, I reach back and touch them, reminding myself that what happened was real. Something was in those woods in 1966, something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that recognized me as surely as I recognized it. And I believe, though I've never told another soul this, that it's still there. Waiting, watching, remembering me just as I remember it. Story 6. My name is Jackson Wright, and I'm going to tell you about something that happened in the summer of 1966. Something I've spent most of my life trying to forget. It was late June when the 5 of us, me, my girlfriend Melissa, and our 3 friends Connor, Elise, and Damien, decided to take a weekend camping trip up in the mountains of San Diego County. We were all in our early 20s, still feeling invincible the way young people do. I was driving my dad's 1963 Chevy Impala, a car he'd reluctantly loaned me with strict instructions to bring it back without a scratch. We left San Diego late, around 8 p.m., after Damien finished his shift at the auto shop. The plan was to reach the campsite by 10, set up in the dark, and spend the next 2 days hiking and swimming. Simple enough, but nothing went according to plan that night. "I think we should have turned back at that last junction," Melissa said, unfolding the paper map across her knees. The dome light cast shadows across her face. Her blonde hair was tied back in a ponytail, and she wore the red flannel shirt I'd given her last Christmas. "We're fine," I insisted, though my knuckles were white on the steering wheel. We'd been driving for nearly 3 hours, and the roads had gotten narrower, the trees pressing closer on either side. From the back seat, Elise leaned forward. "Jack, maybe we should turn around. This doesn't look right." "Elkhorn Valley Road," Connor read from a weathered sign as we passed. "Is that on the map, Mel?" Melissa traced her finger across the paper. "Yeah, but it's just a thin line. Looks like it cuts through about 20 miles of nothing before connecting to the main highway." "Perfect," I said. "We'll take it through and get back on track." Damien, who'd been half asleep against the window, sat up. "What time is it anyway?" I checked my watch. "Just past midnight." "Great," he muttered. "So much for setting up camp before dark." The Impala's headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness as we continued down Elkhorn Valley Road. The pavement narrowed to barely more than a lane and a half, with no center line. Pine trees towered on both sides, their branches occasionally scraping against the roof. The radio had lost reception an hour ago, so the only sounds were the car engine and our increasingly tense conversation. "Look, we'll just find a spot to turn around if this doesn't—" I stopped mid-sentence, tapping the brakes. "What?" Melissa asked. "There's someone on the side of the road up there." About 50 yards ahead, our headlights illuminated a figure sitting at the edge of the pavement. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, or maybe a local who'd broken down. "Who would be out here at this hour?" Elise asked, her voice tight. As we got closer, I slowed the car to about 15 miles per hour. Something wasn't right. The figure wasn't sitting on anything. No rock, no fallen log, just directly on the ground. And it was big, really big. "Jack!" Melissa's voice wavered. At about 30 feet away, I could see it clearly, and my blood went cold. What sat there wasn't human. It was massive, covered in dark hair, with a broad, powerful build. Even seated, it had to be over 6 feet tall. The creature's head turned toward our approaching car, eyes reflecting our headlights with an amber glow. "What the hell is that?" Connor shouted from behind me. "Drive!" Damien's voice was suddenly stone-cold sober. "Drive, Jack!" I pressed harder on the gas, but not hard enough. As we accelerated, movement flashed in the tree line to our right. Something burst from the darkness, another creature, similar to the first, but moving on all fours before rising to a bipedal stance. It was running straight for us. "Go! Go! Go!" Melissa screamed. I floored it. The Impala's engine roared as we picked up speed. But the second creature was fast, impossibly fast. As we passed where it had emerged, it lunged toward the car. Melissa's window was rolled down about 4 inches for air, and in a moment, I'll never forget, a massive arm shot through that gap. Hairy fingers wider than my wrist scraped across Melissa's shoulder. She shrieked and recoiled against me. I swerved hard, nearly losing control as the tires skidded on loose gravel. "It touched me! It touched me!" Melissa was hysterical, pressing herself against the dashboard. In the rearview mirror, I saw both creatures now standing in the middle of the road. The seated one had risen to its full height, towering over its companion. They didn't chase us. They just stood there, watching our taillights disappear into the night. "What the fuck was that?" Connor's voice cracked. "What the actual fuck?" "Is everyone okay?" I asked, struggling to keep the car straight as we tore down the narrow road. "No, we're not okay." Elise was crying now. "What were those things?" Melissa hadn't moved, still pressed against the dashboard, her breathing rapid and shallow. I reached over with one hand and touched her arm. "Mel, are you hurt?" She slowly straightened up, her face pale in the green glow of the dashboard lights. It felt like sandpaper, rough, strong. She looked down at her shoulder. Her flannel shirt was intact, but when she pulled the collar aside, I could see red marks on her skin. "Those were bears, right?" Damien said, though his tone made it clear he didn't believe his own words. "Had to be bears." "Bears don't stand like that," Connor said, "and they don't reach into cars." We drove in terrified silence for the next 20 minutes, the Impala's engine straining as I kept the speedometer above 60 despite the winding road. No one suggested stopping. No one suggested turning back. We just wanted distance between us and whatever we'd seen. Finally, lights appeared ahead, the glowing sign of a gas station just off the highway. I pulled in, the tires crunching over the gravel lot. The place looked closed, but the pumps were still lit. "Stay in the car," I said, cutting the engine. "I'm going to see if there's a phone." "I'm not staying in here alone," Melissa said immediately. In the end, we all got out, no one willing to be separated from the group. That's when we saw what had happened to the car. "Jesus Christ," Damien whispered. The passenger side of the Impala was marked with 4 parallel scratches that ran from the front door all the way to the rear quarter panel. The paint was shredded down to bare metal in places. The back window on that side was cracked, spider-webbing out from a single impact point. "My dad's going to kill me," I said numbly, running my hand along the gouges. "Your dad?" Elise stared at me in disbelief. "That's what you're worried about." Connor opened the back door and froze. "Guys." Our camping gear, which had been neatly packed in the back seat and footwells, was in complete disarray. Sleeping bags were unrolled, Damien's backpack had been torn open, and the cooler we'd brought was dented on one side, its lid hanging open with food items scattered. "It was reaching for something," Damien said quietly. "It was searching for something." The gas station was closed until 6 a.m., according to the sign on the door. We huddled in the car with the doors locked, taking turns staying awake until dawn broke. None of us said much. What was there to say? We'd seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. At 6:15, an old man in overalls unlocked the gas station. His name tag read Earl. He seemed surprised to find 5 terrified young people waiting for him. "You kids have car trouble?" he asked, looking at the scratched Impala. "We need to call the police," I said. Earl's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "What happened?" "We were attacked," Melissa said, "on Elkhorn Valley Road." The old man's face changed again, this time to something I couldn't quite read. "Attacked by what?" We all exchanged glances. How could we explain what we'd seen without sounding crazy? "We're not sure," I finally said. "It was dark. Some kind of animal, big. There were 2 of them." Earl studied us for a long moment, then nodded toward the door. "Phone's inside. Sheriff's office is in Pine Creek, about 12 miles north." While I made the call, the others used the bathroom and bought coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since yesterday. Earl kept looking at the car, especially the scratches. "Never seen a bear do that," he muttered when I came back outside. "It wasn't a bear," Damien said. Earl looked at him sharply. "Didn't say it was." Then he walked back inside. The sheriff arrived 45 minutes later. His name was Sheriff Townsend, a weathered man in his 50s with a grey crew cut and deep lines around his eyes. He examined the car, took photos with a Polaroid camera, and interviewed each of us separately. When it was my turn, we stood by his patrol car while he flipped through a small notebook. "So, Mr. Wright, tell me exactly what you saw." I described everything as clearly as I could. The seated figure, the second creature emerging from the trees, the arm reaching through the window, the damage to the car. And you're saying these creatures were what exactly? I don't know, I admitted. They were huge, covered in dark hair. They moved like they knew what they were doing. Sheriff Townsend wrote something down, then looked up at me with narrowed eyes. You kids been drinking? Taking anything else? No, sir. We were just trying to get to our campsite. Uh-huh. He closed his notebook. Well, I'll file a report. Probably vandals. Lot of troublemakers in these parts, especially in summer. Teenagers with nothing better to do than scare city folks. Sheriff, with all due respect, these weren't teenagers. Whatever we saw, it wasn't human. He studied me for a long moment. Son, I've been policing these mountains for 27 years. I know every creature that lives in these woods. What you're describing doesn't exist. But the scratches could have been caused by branches if you were driving fast down a narrow road. As for the mess inside your car, well, panic can make people do strange things. It was clear he wouldn't believe us. The official report would classify this as vandalism, maybe a prank gone wrong. Nothing more. We abandoned our camping plans and headed back to San Diego that morning. The drive was silent, except for occasional murmurs about what we'd experienced. Melissa kept her window rolled up tight, despite the summer heat. Every time we passed a wooded area, I could feel her tense beside me. Back in the city, I had to face my father's anger about the car. The body shop quoted $340 for repairs. Nearly 2 months' worth of my salary from the hardware store. Dad made me pay every penny, convinced I'd been racing or driving recklessly. No monster did this, Jackson, he said, inspecting the scratches. This is what happens when you're not careful with other people's property. In the weeks that followed, we tried to move on. Connor found an article in an old newspaper about strange sightings in that area dating back to the 1940s, but nothing concrete. Elise's brother was a park ranger, and he dismissed our story entirely, saying we'd probably seen a couple of black bears. But we knew what we saw, the way those creatures moved, the intelligence in their actions, the coordinated way they approached the car, one as a distraction, one to attack. Melissa had nightmares for months. She'd wake up gasping, claiming she could feel rough fingers on her shoulder. The red marks where the creature had touched her faded after a few days. But sometimes she said the spot would itch intensely, especially at night. We stayed in touch, the 5 of us, bound by something no one else would ever understand. But things changed. 3 months after the incident, Damien refused to go on a hunting trip with his father, something they'd done together since he was 12. Connor started seeing a therapist, though he never told her the real reason for his sudden anxiety about driving at night. Melissa and I stuck it out for another year, but the experience had changed us both. She couldn't stand being in the dark anymore. Camping, night drives, even movies in theaters became impossible for her. We broke up in the summer of '67. By 1970, I'd had enough of California altogether. Every time I drove on a rural road, especially at night, I felt watched. The trees seemed to hide secrets. Shadows moved in ways they shouldn't. I relocated to Arizona, where the open desert meant you could see for miles in every direction. No surprises hiding in the darkness. The others stayed in California, but they adapted. Connor became a real estate developer, building housing tracts that required clearing wooded areas, making things safer, he called it, when we met for drinks during my rare visits back. Elise became a biologist, studying known animal species with a methodical dedication that seemed to bring her comfort. Damien joined the police force, carrying a gun at all times. We still get together every few years, usually in well-lit restaurants in busy parts of town. We talk about our lives, our families, our jobs, normal things, but there's always a moment when the conversation lulls and we look at each other with the shared knowledge of what happened on Elkhorn Valley Road. I checked a map recently. That road doesn't exist anymore, at least not under that name. It's been rerouted, widened, incorporated into the growing network of highways that connect California's rural communities to its cities. Progress, they call it. Sometimes I wonder if those creatures are still out there, watching from the tree line as the world changes around them, waiting beside roads that rarely see traffic, reaching through windows into the comfortable safety people think they have. I haven't driven on a rural road at night in over 50 years. I don't intend to start now. Story 7. The stench hit us first, like a wall of decay that flooded through the open windows of my dad's Chevy. Rotting vegetation and stagnant water, but worse. Something animal, something dead. My stomach turned instantly. "Rachel, what is that smell?" Jerry's fingers tightened on the steering wheel as she carefully backed down the narrow dirt road. I didn't answer. My eyes were fixed on something outside my window, something that shouldn't be there. It had been standing so still, I'd mistaken it for a moss-covered stump. But stumps don't move. Stumps don't rise up on two legs. Stumps don't have eyes that catch what's left of the daylight. My scream tore through the car before I could stop it. The thing was right there, not 3 feet from my open window. Tall, maybe 7 feet, covered in some kind of slick, dark hair or fur, matted with mud and something that glistened wetly in the fading light. Water or slime dripped from its body onto the dirt road. "Drive! Jerry, drive!" I shrieked, but my voice seemed to come from somewhere else, somewhere distant. Jerry's head snapped toward my window. Her eyes went wide, her mouth dropped open. But she didn't move, didn't drive, just froze. The creature tilted what I assumed was its head. I could make out no distinct features in the mess of vegetation and hair that covered it, just those eyes, reflecting the dying light. And that smell. God, that smell. Then it moved. A long arm, too long for any normal person, shot through my open window. Fingers like tree roots, knobbed and dark, grabbed at my arm. The skin was rough, not like bark exactly, but not like human skin either, cold and damp. I jerked backwards, smashing against Jerry. That broke her trance. She screamed and stomped on the accelerator. The car lurched backward with a spray of gravel. The sudden movement snapped the creature's grip from my arm. I felt its fingertips scrape across my skin as it lost hold. The Chevy bounced violently down the rough dirt road. Jerry's hands were white-knuckled on the wheel, her face a frozen mask of terror. I twisted in my seat to look back. The creature stood motionless in the road, watching us go. Then it stepped sideways into the thick brush that lined the road and vanished, just melted away into the shadows and trees like it had never been there at all. "What was that?" Jerry's voice cracked. "Rachel, what the fuck was that?" "I don't know," I whispered, rubbing the cold, damp spot on my arm where it had touched me. "I don't know." Sheriff's Deputy Marcus Wilson looked like he believed us. That was the surprising part. He didn't roll his eyes or exchange that look adults get when teenagers tell them something crazy. He just wrote everything down in his little notebook, asked clarifying questions, and nodded a lot. "You said it smelled like rotting vegetation," he asked, not looking up from his notes. "Yes, sir," I said. We sat in the small interview room at the Pinewood Sheriff's Station. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, like dead plants and stagnant water, but worse. "And how tall would you say it was?" Jerry spoke up. "Taller than a man, maybe 7 feet. It was hard to tell in the dark, but it towered over the car." Deputy Wilson nodded again. "And you're both certain it wasn't a bear? We get black bears in those woods." "It wasn't a bear," I said firmly. "Bears don't stand on 2 legs that long, and they don't have arms like that. This thing had arms like a person, just longer, and only 2 toes like visible in the mud. 2 toes? That seemed to catch his interest. Yes, sir. I saw when it stepped back. Its foot left a print with just 2 big toe-like things. Wilson closed his notebook. I'd like to go out there today, see if we can find any evidence before the rain comes in. Would you girls be willing to show me exactly where this happened? Jerry and I exchanged looks. The thought of going back to Whisper Lake made my skin crawl, but I nodded. Yes, sir. We can show you. The drive back to Whisper Lake was the longest 30 minutes of my life. Jerry sat in the back of Deputy Wilson's patrol car while I rode in the passenger seat directing him. The late morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the road, so different from the previous evening's dim light. It's just up ahead, I said, pointing, where the road narrows before the last turn to the lake. Wilson slowed the patrol car. Here? A little further. Just past that big oak. He stopped the car exactly where we'd encountered the creature. In daylight, the spot looked so ordinary, just a narrow dirt road lined with trees and underbrush. No sign that anything strange had ever happened here. This is it, I said. My voice sounded small. Wilson got out first, then opened our doors. Show me where you saw it standing. I pointed to a spot beside the road. Right there. It was standing right there when we first saw it. Wilson walked over, looking at the ground. He crouched down, examining the earth. Do you see something? Jerry asked, staying close to the patrol car. Maybe. He moved deeper into the underbrush, pushing aside ferns and low-hanging branches. Come look at this. Reluctantly, we approached. Wilson pointed to an impression in the soft mud beside the road. My breath caught. It was a footprint, a massive footprint, easily 17 inches long and oddly shaped. Not like a human foot, not like an animal paw. It had just 2 distinct toe-like protrusions at the front and a wide, flat base. That's it, I whispered. That's what I saw, its foot. Wilson pulled a folding ruler from his pocket and measured the print. He took photos with a small camera and made a plaster cast of the impression. All very official, very police-like, which somehow made the whole thing more terrifying. If he was taking it this seriously, then maybe... Have you ever seen anything like this before? Jerry asked him. Wilson didn't answer right away. He was bagging a few leaves and some mud from around the print. Finally, he stood up. I've been a deputy in this county for 18 years, he said. These woods hold all kinds of secrets. Let's just say you two aren't the first to report something unusual around Whisper Lake. A chill ran down my spine despite the warm August day. The news spread through Pinewood like wildfire. By the time we got back to town, it seemed everyone knew about the bush beast, as old Mrs. Garrity at the diner had immediately dubbed it. Always knew there was something weird in those woods, she told me the next day when I stopped in for a milkshake. My Herbert, God rest his soul, he saw something out there back in '52. Same thing, tall, covered in moss or weeds, stinking to high heaven. No one believed him neither. Soon others came forward. Mr. Jenkins, who ran the hardware store, claimed he'd seen something matching our description fishing in Whisper Lake at dawn 5 years earlier. Catching fish with its hands, he insisted, just standing there in the mist, grabbing them right out of the water. 3 loggers who worked the North Ridge said they'd smelled that distinctive rotting odor for years and would never work near the lake after sunset. You smell that stink. You pack up and go home, one of them told Deputy Wilson. That's always been the rule. Even Principal Hargrove admitted that when he was a teenager in the 30s, locals warned children to stay away from Whisper Lake after dark because of the Moss Man. The Pinewood Gazette ran a front-page story. Local teens encounter mysterious creature. They printed sketches based on our descriptions. Seeing it on paper made it both more real and more absurd at the same time. Within a week, Pinewood was crawling with outsiders. Amateur cryptozoologists, tabloid reporters, curiosity seekers, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the bush beast. They tramped through the woods, set up cameras, left bait. The creature, if it was ever there at all, didn't show itself. 2 weeks after our encounter, Jerry refused to talk about it anymore. "I just want to forget it happened," she told me over lunch at school. "People are starting to call us the Monster Girls." Tommy Watson asked me if I'd been dropping acid at the lake. I understood. The whispers in the hallways, the sidelong glances. Even some of the teachers looked at us differently, but I couldn't let it go, not while I was still having the dreams. Every night since our encounter, I'd dreamt of the creature. Not nightmares exactly, just dreams where it stood at the edge of Whisper Lake, watching me. Sometimes it would wade into the water and disappear beneath the surface. Sometimes it would just stand there, dripping and silent. I always woke up with that smell in my nostrils. "I'm going back," I told Jerry. "Tonight." "Are you insane?" Her fork clattered to her tray. "Why would you do that?" "I need to know for sure. Was it real? Is it still there?" "Of course it was real. We both saw it. Deputy Wilson found its footprint." "Then what is it? Where did it come from? Why haven't we heard about it before?" Jerry shook her head. "Listen to yourself, Rachel. You sound like those freaks from the city with their cameras and Bigfoot theories. Let it go." But I couldn't. That night, I took my dad's car again. He worked nights at the lumber mill, so he wouldn't miss it. Mom was at her sister's in Riverside for the weekend. No one would know I was gone. I drove slowly up the winding road to Whisper Lake, headlights cutting through the darkness. The woods seemed more alive at night, full of rustling leaves and distant calls of nocturnal animals. Or maybe that's just how fear transforms ordinary things. I parked at the small clearing that served as a makeshift lot for fishermen and teenagers looking for privacy. The lake spread out before me, a black mirror reflecting the three-quarter moon. Its surface was perfectly still. I stayed in the car for a long time, engine off, just watching and listening. Part of me hoped, expected, the creature would simply appear, drawn by my presence. But the night remained quiet. Finally, I got out. The air was cool and damp. I took a flashlight from the glove compartment and walked down to the shoreline. Small waves lapped at the rocky beach. Crickets chirped in the underbrush. "Hello!" My voice sounded absurd in the darkness. "Is anyone there?" Nothing. I walked along the shore, flashlight beams sweeping across the water and back to the tree line. What was I doing here? What did I expect to find? That's when I smelled it, that unmistakable stench of decay and stagnant water. My heart kicked against my ribs. I swung the flashlight toward the source of the smell. 20 yards away, at the point where the trees met the shoreline, the water was moving, not with waves or ripples, but as if something was rising from below. A dark shape broke the surface. Water cascaded off it as it stood up, and up, and up. The creature stood fully 7 feet tall. In the moonlight, I could see it clearly now. Not moss or vegetation, as I'd first thought, but a covering of dark, matted hair or fur, slick with lake water and what looked like stringy algae. Beneath that covering was a body, roughly humanoid but wrong somehow. Too thin in places, too thick in others, proportions that didn't match any animal I knew. It had no neck that I could see, just a rounded head that merged with broad shoulders. Its arms hung long at its sides, ending in those strange, root-like fingers. And those eyes, reflective like an animal's, but aware, intelligent. It saw me. It knew I was there. I should have run, should have sprinted back to the car and driven away as fast as possible. But I stood frozen, flashlight beam trained on the creature. It didn't charge, didn't roar, or make any sound at all. It just watched me, water dripping from its body. Then, slowly, it raised one long arm and extended it toward me, not grabbing but reaching, almost like a greeting or a plea. The gesture broke my trance. I stumbled backward, nearly falling. The creature took a step forward, then stopped when I raised the flashlight higher. "What are you?" I whispered. It tilted its head, like it had the first time I saw it. Then it made a sound, not a growl or a roar, but a low, rumbling vibration that I felt more than heard. It seemed to come from deep inside its body. I took another step back. "Stay away from me!" The creature lowered its arm. It stood motionless for a long moment, just watching me. Then, with surprising grace for something so large, it turned and walked back into the lake. The dark water rose to its waist, its chest, its shoulders. Then it was gone, leaving only ripples on the surface. I ran back to the car, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced I would see that slime-covered figure following me down the road. I told no one about my second encounter, not Jerry, not Deputy Wilson, no one. Something about that reaching gesture, that vibrating sound. It felt private somehow, and the look in those reflected eyes. It wasn't threatening, it was something else, something I couldn't name. The excitement in Pinewood eventually died down. The reporters and monster hunters drifted away to chase other stories. By October, the bush beast was old news, just another local legend to tell around campfires. Jerry and I stayed friends, but something had changed between us. An unspoken agreement to never mention that August night. We both just wanted to be normal teenagers again. But on humid summer nights, when the air is heavy and still, I sometimes catch that smell coming through my open bedroom window. Rotting vegetation and stagnant water. A reminder. And sometimes I dream of Whisper Lake, of dark water parting as something rises to the surface, of eyes that watch and know, of a creature that reaches out, not to grab or harm, but to connect. In those dreams, I'm never afraid. In those dreams, I reach back. Story 8. The Alaskan air bit at my face as I stood on the deck of the tour boat. Cold, even for summer in Juneau. My wife Linda clutched her windbreaker tighter around her neck, while our daughter Melissa, 15 and already bored with our family vacation, kept her eyes glued to the water for any sign of whales. It was June 12th, 1998. I remember the date exactly because it was the day that changed everything I thought I knew about the world. "This is a waste of money, Dad," Melissa had complained that morning at the hotel as I handed over my credit card for 3 tickets to the whale-watching tour. 2 hours into the excursion, she'd warmed up, especially after we'd spotted a pod of orcas about 30 minutes earlier. The boat was packed. Probably 50, maybe 60 tourists crammed onto the deck, all of us eager for another sighting. Captain Rick, a weathered man with leathery skin and a salt and pepper beard, had assured us the waters around Juneau were teeming with marine life in June. He wasn't wrong. "Look, bears! Bears on the beach!" The first shout came from a kid maybe 7 or 8 years old, pointing frantically toward the shoreline. The reaction was immediate. A stampede of tourists rushed to the starboard side of the boat, nearly tipping us with the sudden shift in weight. I grabbed Linda's hand, and we pushed through the crowd, making sure Melissa was right behind us. "Where? I don't see anything," Linda said, squinting at the tree line. I reached into my pocket for the disposable camera I'd bought at the hotel gift shop. That's when I saw them. "Those ain't bears," I said, my voice coming out quieter than I'd intended. About a football field's distance away on the rocky beach, 4 large figures moved along the shoreline. At first glance in the afternoon light, I could understand the confusion. Dark, hulking forms that could be mistaken for brown bears. But these weren't bears, not even close. The boat's motor cut suddenly, leaving us in eerie silence, except for the lapping of waves against the hull and the collective gasp from the passengers. "Oh my God!" Linda whispered beside me, her fingers digging into my arm. "Shannon, are those—" I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone dry. One of the creatures waded through the shallow water on all fours, but the other three walked upright on two legs. "Bigfoot," someone behind me said matter-of-factly. A man in his 60s with a University of Washington cap and a pair of high-powered binoculars pressed to his face. "That's a family of Sasquatch right there." A woman next to him, presumably his wife, swatted his arm. "Don't be ridiculous, Harold." But Harold wasn't being ridiculous. We were all seeing it. "Daddy, what are they doing?" Melissa asked. Her earlier teenage apathy completely vanished. She stood on her tiptoes trying to see over the crowd. I lifted her up slightly so she could get a better view. "Looks like they're digging in the sand." The creatures moved methodically along the beach. Even from this distance, their size was obvious. The largest one had to be at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair with powerful limbs and broad shoulders. A few passengers had climbed up on the bench seats for a better view. Those with binoculars passed them around, everyone desperate for a closer look. "They're digging for razor clams," Captain Rick said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. He'd joined us at the railing, his own weathered binoculars trained on the shore. "See how they're pulling something from the sand, then taking it to those rocks." He was right. The creatures would dig with powerful hands, extract something from the wet sand, then move to a cluster of large rocks. With seemingly effortless strength, they would smash whatever they'd found against the stone, then lift it to their mouths. "They're eating the meat," Linda said, her voice a mix of horror and fascination. I raised my disposable camera, knowing full well it was useless at this distance. The creatures would appear as nothing more than dark specks if they showed up at all. But I had to try. I snapped picture after picture, burning through half the roll in minutes. All around us, other passengers did the same. Some had professional-looking cameras with telephoto lenses. A couple even had video cameras. Surely someone was getting better documentation than my cheap disposable. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes, we watched in stunned silence as these impossible creatures, these myths come to life, foraged along the Alaskan shore as casually as a human family might pick berries in the woods. Then, as if sensing they were being watched, the largest one straightened up to its full height and seemed to look directly at our boat. A collective shudder ran through the crowd. Even at this distance, the feeling of being observed by something so primeval, so unknown, sent ice down my spine. Without any apparent signal, the creatures began to move away from the shore. 3 walked upright with a rolling, powerful gait that was both familiar and alien. The 4th, smaller one, a juvenile perhaps, occasionally dropped to all fours before rising again to walk on 2 legs. Within moments, they had disappeared into the dense tree line that bordered the beach. No one spoke for several seconds after they vanished. Did that just happen?" Linda finally asked, her voice trembling slightly. Before I could answer, Captain Rick cleared his throat loudly. "Folks, I know what you think you just saw," he began, his tone measured and careful. "But there are a lot of things in these woods that can trick the eye. Brown bears standing up, moose in the shadows." "Those weren't bears," interrupted a woman clutching a professional camera. "I got pictures, clear ones." Several others nodded in agreement, holding up their cameras. "Ma'am, I've been running tours in these waters for 27 years, Captain Rick said, a forced smile on his weathered face. "Trust me when I say the light and distance can play tricks." But his eyes told a different story. He'd seen them too, just as clearly as the rest of us. The mood on the boat changed. Excited chatter erupted as people compared what they'd witnessed. Some were already reviewing digital camera displays, showing their images to others. A man in a Seattle Mariners cap was rewinding his video camera tape, promising to share copies with anyone who wanted one. "This is going to be on the news tonight," Melissa said, eyes wide with excitement. "We're going to be famous." I nodded absently, still staring at the now empty shoreline. Something deep in my gut told me this wasn't going to play out the way my daughter imagined. The remainder of the tour felt surreal. Captain Rick tried to redirect our attention to a group of sea lions lounging on rocks, but no one cared. We'd just seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. Whales and sea lions suddenly seemed mundane by comparison. As we docked back at the Juneau harbor, people exchanged contact information, promising to send copies of photos and video footage. The man with the University of Washington cap, Harold, pressed a business card into my hand. "When this breaks, you'll want to have your story straight," he said with a knowing look. "They'll try to discredit us." I pocketed the card without responding. Harold's intensity made me uncomfortable, but part of me wondered if he might be right. That evening, in our hotel room, we flipped through every local channel, waiting for news of the sighting. Nothing. We called the front desk to ask about the location of the nearest photo development place. The clerk directed us to a 1-hour photo shop a few blocks away. "Let's get these developed now," I told Linda, holding up my disposable camera. "I want to see if we caught anything." An hour later, we flipped through the freshly developed photos with growing disappointment. Just as I'd feared, the creatures appeared as nothing more than dark, indistinguishable specks against the shoreline. "These could be anything," Linda said, squinting at one of the better shots. "Bears, moose, even people in dark clothing." "We know what we saw," I insisted. That night we ate dinner at a local seafood restaurant. I couldn't help overhearing conversations at nearby tables, wondering if anyone else from our boat tour might be discussing the experience. But if they were there, they kept their voices low. The next morning I checked every newspaper in the hotel lobby. Nothing about Bigfoot sightings. No mentions of unusual creatures on the Juneau shoreline. It was as if it had never happened. For the remaining 3 days of our vacation, we kept checking the news. I even called the tour company, asking if they'd heard anything about unusual wildlife spotted during recent tours. The receptionist said she hadn't heard anything special, and did I want to book another excursion? When we returned home to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, I expected someone from the boat to have gone public. Surely those professional cameras and video recordings had captured better evidence than my disposable camera. I checked national news, scanned the internet at the local library, even picked up a tabloid at the grocery store checkout. Nothing. 2 weeks after returning home, I found Harold's business card in the pocket of my jacket. He'd written his email address on the back. I sent him a message from my new Hotmail account, asking if he'd heard anything about our shared experience. His reply came 3 days later. "Mr. Morgan, I've been making inquiries. Several passengers had clear photographs and video footage. 2 individuals reported being approached at their hotels by men claiming to be from the Wildlife Service, who asked to see their cameras and photographs to document the regional wildlife. The cameras and photos were never returned. Others simply chose to keep quiet. I advise you to do the same for now. Harold." I showed the email to Linda, who dismissed it as paranoid conspiracy thinking. But the seed of doubt had been planted in my mind. Why hadn't this made the news? With 50 to 60 witnesses, many with photographic evidence, how could such an incredible sighting remain unreported? Over the next few months, I made attempts to contact the tour company again. Each time, they politely but firmly stated they had no record of unusual sightings during any of their tours. When I pressed harder during one call, mentioning Bigfoot specifically, the line went quiet for a moment before the manager informed me they didn't appreciate prank calls and hung up. By Christmas of 1998, even Melissa had stopped bringing it up. "Maybe we all just saw some bears, Dad," she said one evening, clearly tired of my fixation. "Or maybe some locals were playing a prank with costumes." But I knew what I'd seen, what we'd all seen. The fluid movement, the impossible height, the casual strength as they smashed clams against rocks. No costume could replicate that, especially not at a distance where details should have been obscured. As the years passed, my certainty never wavered, though I spoke of it less frequently. Linda and I divorced in 2004, and while there were many factors, my unhealthy obsession with that Bigfoot thing, her words, didn't help matters. Melissa went to college, graduated, started her own life. Occasionally, when she visited, usually after a few beers, she'd bring it up. "Remember that time we saw Sasquatch in Alaska?" she'd say with a laugh, but I could tell she wasn't sure anymore. Memory is fragile that way, especially when society tells you something isn't possible. In 2008, I tried to track down Harold through his old email address. It bounced back. His business card listed him as a professor of anthropology at a small college in Washington state. When I called the school, they had no record of him ever working there. That was when the first real chill of doubt crept in. Had Harold been genuine? Or was he part of whatever had kept our sighting quiet? I'll never know. Now it's 2023. 25 years have passed since that summer day in Alaska. I'm retired, living in the same house in Oak Ridge, spending my days fishing and watching my grandkids when Melissa drops them off. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I pull out that old photo album from our Alaska trip. The blurry specks on the shoreline could indeed be anything. Bears, people, shadows. But I know what they were. I was there. I saw them with my own eyes. What bothers me most isn't the existence of Bigfoot. That's actually the easiest part for me to accept now. What haunts me is how effectively the story was buried. 50 to 60 witnesses, multiple cameras, broad daylight, and nothing. Not a single credible report ever emerged. It makes me wonder what else happens in this world that we never hear about. What other truths are kept from public knowledge, and who decides what we're allowed to believe? Someone on that boat must have gotten clear pictures. Someone must have evidence tucked away in an attic or a safety deposit box. Part of me still hopes that someday those images will come to light, that someone braver or more connected than Shannon Morgan from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, will finally share the truth of what we all saw on that summer day in 1998. Until then, I keep watching the tree line whenever I'm in the woods. Not out of fear, but hope. Hope that I might once again glimpse something that isn't supposed to exist. Story 9. The Datine. My face slammed into the back of the driver's seat. The seatbelt caught, digging into my shoulder and chest. The car skidded slightly on the icy road. "Jesus, Mike!" my sister Elaine shouted from the passenger seat. "What the hell?" I rubbed my nose, checking for blood. My boyfriend Jake reached over and touched my arm. "You okay, Anne?" he asked. I nodded, still dazed. Mike, my brother-in-law, didn't answer any of us. He sat frozen, hands gripping the wheel, staring straight ahead through the windshield. The headlights cut through the early evening darkness of the mountain road outside Ketchum. "Mike!" Elaine tried again. "Look," he whispered. We all followed his gaze. At first I saw nothing but the empty road ahead, bordered by dense pine forest. Then movement caught my eye. Something was crossing the road about 50 yards ahead. "Is that a hunter?" I asked, squinting to make out the orange shape in the distance. No one answered. As my eyes adjusted, I realized what I was seeing wasn't a hunter in an orange jacket. It was something else entirely. The figure stood at least 7 feet tall. It moved with an awkward rolling gait across the road, and over its shoulder hung the unmistakable form of a deer. Not a whole deer. The animal's body had been snapped nearly in half, draped over the figure's left shoulder like a grotesque scarf. Blood glistened black in the headlights. "What the fuck is that?" Jake whispered beside me. The creature didn't acknowledge our vehicle. It continued its hobbling power walk across the road, reaching the other side and pausing at the tree line. I watched as it readjusted the deer carcass, tucking it under its left arm now. The deer's head dangled lifelessly, its eyes reflecting our headlights for a brief, unsettling moment. "That's no bear," Elaine said, her voice barely audible. Mike suddenly reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small disposable camera. Without a word, he unlocked his door. "Mike, don't!" Elaine grabbed his arm. "Are you crazy?" "I need to get a picture," he said, shaking her off. "No one will believe this." Before any of us could stop him, Mike slipped out of the car. The cold mountain air rushed in, along with the scent of pine and something else. Something musky and strange. "Mike!" Elaine hissed, but he was already moving toward the edge of the road, camera raised. Through the gaps in the trees, we could still make out parts of the creature. It had stopped moving forward, but remained partially visible. A massive, broad back, covered in what looked like matted, dark fur, an enormous arm, the broken deer corpse, clutched against its side. Mike crept closer, step by cautious step. The night had gone completely silent. No wind, no distant traffic, not even the call of a night bird. Just our breathing inside the car and the soft crunch of Mike's boots on the icy gravel shoulder. He raised the camera. That's when it happened. The creature made a sound, a guttural noise that carried easily through the still air. To me, it sounded like ooga. Elaine would later insist it was more like wooga. Either way, it was no animal call I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite bestial. Mike froze. The creature turned. For one terrible second, I caught a glimpse of its face through a gap in the branches. Not human, not ape. Something in between and yet neither. Eyes that reflected amber in the headlights. A heavy brow. A mouth set in what looked like a permanent grimace. Then it charged, not fully at us, but halfway into the open, dropping the deer carcass behind it. "Mike, run!" Jake yelled from beside me. Mike didn't need telling twice. He turned and sprinted back to the car, practically diving into the driver's seat and slamming the door. His breath came in ragged gasps. "Did you get it? Did you get a picture?" Elaine asked, her face pale. Mike just shook his head, fumbling with his keys. The engine roared to life. The creature stood at the edge of the road now, watching us. Just watching. 10 long seconds passed as we stared at each other across the distance, the headlights illuminating only parts of its massive form. A shoulder here, the side of its head there, a hand with unnaturally long fingers. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and vanished back into the woods, leaving the mangled deer behind. Mike hit the gas and we sped away, no one speaking for several miles. That was 27 years ago, January of 1996. I was 22, visiting my sister and her husband at their new home in Ketchum. Jake and I had been dating since sophomore year at the University of Illinois. Mike had made it big with an early internet startup and cashed out just before the bubble burst. The ski trip was his treat, a way to show off his newfound success and the perks of Idaho mountain living. None of us expected it would change our lives forever. You have to understand, I tell people now when I rarely share the story. Without the 3 other witnesses, I might have convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. After it happened, we drove straight back to Elaine and Mike's house. No stops. Mike kept checking the rearview mirror. Jake kept his arm around me in the back seat. No one spoke until we were inside with the doors locked. "What the hell was that?" Jake finally asked, his hands shaking as he accepted the whiskey Mike poured. "Sasquatch," Mike said simply, knocking back his drink in one go. "Has to be." Elaine laughed, a high, nervous sound. "Don't be ridiculous. Bigfoot isn't real." "Then what did we just see?" I asked. No one had an answer. The next morning, Mike wanted to go back and look for tracks. Jake refused immediately. After some argument, Elaine agreed to accompany Mike while Jake and I stayed behind. They returned 3 hours later, their faces grim. "The deer was gone," Elaine said, hanging up her coat. "But there were tracks." Mike nodded. "Big ones. Not bear, wrong shape, and bare feet in January in the snow. Whatever it was came back for its kill." "Did you take pictures this time?" Jake asked. Mike pulled out his camera. Yes, and I found this. He held up a tuft of dark, coarse hair. It was caught on a branch, right where we saw it standing, he explained. I'm going to send it to a lab. We spent the rest of that vacation in a strange limbo. We went skiing as planned, but our hearts weren't in it. Every shadow in the trees looked threatening. Every crack of a distant branch made us jump. We didn't talk much about what we'd seen, as if speaking of it might somehow summon the creature back. The night before Jake and I were due to fly back to Illinois, Mike finally broached the subject again. I've been researching, he said over dinner. There have been other sightings around here. Not many, but enough to make me think we're not crazy. So what exactly are you saying it was? Jake asked. I could tell by his tone he was still skeptical, trying to rationalize what we'd seen. A North American great ape, Mike replied confidently. An undiscovered primate species that's managed to stay hidden. Small population, probably. Highly intelligent. That thing wasn't just an ape, I said, surprising myself with my certainty. Did you see its face? I saw it, Elaine said quietly. It wasn't right. Mike shook his head. Stress and fear can distort perception. Our brains try to make sense of the unfamiliar by relating it to the familiar. It understood us, I insisted. When you raised that camera, it knew what you were doing. Jake squeezed my hand under the table. I could tell he thought I was getting carried away. Let's just wait for the hair analysis, Mike said soothingly. The analysis never provided clear answers. The lab initially reported unknown primate, before a secondary examination declared it contaminated bear fur with human hair. Mike was convinced they were covering something up. I wasn't sure what to believe. Jake and I broke up 6 months later. He never outright said the Ketchum incident was the reason, but things were different between us after that night. He became uncomfortable whenever I brought it up, eventually suggesting I might benefit from talking to someone professionally about my fixation. Elaine and I still discuss it when we're alone. Her marriage to Mike ended 5 years after the encounter, for unrelated reasons. At least, that's what she claims. Mike became obsessed with proving what we saw, disappearing into the mountains for weeks at a time with cameras and recording equipment. He never saw it again, Elaine told me on the phone last year. But he never stopped looking. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters, joining online forums, even attending a couple of Sasquatch conventions. Most of what I found was clearly hoaxes or misidentifications. But some stories, the ones told quietly, reluctantly, by ordinary people who gained nothing from sharing their experiences, those rang true. They matched what we saw. The face is what I struggle most to describe even now. It wasn't a gorilla face or a human face or even something in between. The proportions were wrong. The eyes held an intelligence that seemed to assess us, to make calculations. When it made that sound, that ooga or wooga, it wasn't a warning growl or a territorial display. It was communication. I've drawn it dozens of times over the years, trying to capture what I saw. None of my attempts come close. The best I can describe is a face with a prominent brow, deep-set eyes, a wide, flat nose, and a mouth that seemed almost permanently set in what looked like a grimace. But that description fails to capture the essence of what made it so disturbing, the sense that behind those eyes was a mind that understood exactly what it was looking at. Last summer, I returned to Ketchum alone. Mike had passed away the previous winter, heart attack while hiking, they said. I felt I owed it to him to visit the spot one more time. Elaine gave me directions, though she refused to come along. The road looked different in daylight, in summer, narrower than I remembered, the trees less menacing. I parked where we'd stopped that night and got out of the rental car. The mountain air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Birds called to each other in the trees. Nothing sinister, nothing strange. I walked to the spot where we'd seen it cross. where Mike had stood with his camera, where the creature had dropped the deer and charged halfway toward us. A memorial plaque for Mike had been placed on a boulder nearby, Elaine's doing. Michael James Thompson, explorer, seeker of truth. I stood there for almost an hour, not sure what I was waiting for. Closure, maybe, or validation. Some sign that what we'd experienced was real. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a flash of movement deep among the trees. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. A deer, probably, or a bear. This was their territory, after all. But the way the branches parted, slowly and deliberately, didn't seem like the random movements of wildlife. Something large was moving in there, pushing the foliage aside with purpose. I hurried back to my car, fumbling with the keys. As I slid behind the wheel, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Nothing there, just trees and shadows. I started the engine. That's when I heard it, faint but unmistakable. Wooga! I didn't look back. I drove straight to the airport and took the first flight home. I don't tell this story often. When I do, I stick to the facts. What I saw, what I heard, what I felt. No embellishments, no theories, just the raw experience of that January night, 27 years ago, when 4 ordinary people encountered something extraordinary on a mountain road in Ketchum, Idaho. Mike insisted until his dying day it was just an undiscovered ape species. Maybe he was right. That's the rational explanation after all, the scientific one. But Elaine and I know better. What we saw wasn't just an animal. It wasn't just a missing link or evolutionary oddity. It was something else entirely, something watching us from the edges of our world, something that knows we're here. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I lie awake wondering if it's still out there, waiting, watching, carrying broken deer through snowy forests, making that sound that still echoes in my nightmares. Ooga, or maybe wooga. I'll never know for sure, and I'll never stop looking over my shoulder when I walk alone in the woods. Story 10. I never expected our California vacation to end with us becoming cryptid enthusiasts. But when you see something that shouldn't exist with your own eyes, it changes you. My name's Amanda. My husband Pete and I lived in a cramped apartment in New York back then, both of us working too many hours. Me at an advertising agency, and Pete developing software for a financial tech company. When we finally saved enough vacation days for a proper trip, we decided on California. It wasn't just the wine country or San Francisco that drew us. It was the ancient redwoods we'd both dreamed of seeing since childhood. We'd planned everything meticulously, 10 days, visiting San Francisco, Napa Valley, and finally the redwoods before flying out of Redding. Our itinerary left 3 full days to explore the forests before heading home. Pete had researched hiking trails obsessively, marking routes on maps and downloading offline GPS coordinates. The Redwoods River Resort and Pub looked perfect online, individual cabins nestled among towering trees with the sound of flowing water nearby. When we arrived, it exceeded our expectations. Our cabin had a rustic wooden exterior with a small porch, but inside it was surprisingly modern with a plush king bed, a kitchenette, and a bathroom with better water pressure than our New York apartment. "This is heaven," I said, dropping my backpack on the floor. Pete stood at the window, staring at the massive trees surrounding us. "Look at these giants. Some are probably 1,000 years old." That evening, we sat on the porch with beers from the resort pub, listening to the river and planning our first hike for dawn. The couple who ran the resort had given us tips about early morning wildlife viewing. "The animals are most active at dawn," the husband had explained while checking us in. "If you're quiet and patient, you might see deer, elk, maybe even bears." Pete tapped his backpack, got the good binoculars ready. We'd spent a ridiculous amount on those Pentax binoculars, but Pete insisted they were worth it. "Wildlife photography grade," he'd said when purchasing them. I had teased him about the expense but was secretly excited to use them. We woke before sunrise the next morning. The air was crisp and cold, our breath forming small clouds as we started up the trail Pete had selected. The forest floor was soft with pine needles and decaying leaves, making our footsteps nearly silent. Towering redwoods created a cathedral-like canopy above us, filtering the morning light into misty beams. "Look," Pete whispered, pointing to our right where a doe and her fawn grazed quietly. I raised the binoculars, adjusting the focus. The detail was incredible. I could see the twitch of the doe's ears, the damp shine of her nose. We stood still until they moved on, then continued hiking. Over the next 2 hours, we spotted countless birds, a family of raccoons, and even 2 American black bears foraging far enough away to observe safely. "This is incredible," I whispered to Pete. "I've never seen so much wildlife." The trail grew steeper as we continued, but the exercise felt good after days of driving. Around 9 a.m., we reached a small, rocky overlook that provided a view across a section of the forest. A small clearing was visible in the distance, surrounded by the massive trees. "Let's take a break," Pete suggested, slinging off his backpack. He pulled out a water bottle and some granola bars, while I found a flat rock to sit on. The forest was peaceful. Wind rustled through the canopy high above us, and birds called to each other, but otherwise, it felt like we had the entire wilderness to ourselves. Pete stood at the edge of the overlook, scanning the forest with the binoculars. I watched him as I chewed my granola bar, noticing how he suddenly froze. "What is it?" I asked, standing up. "Another bear?" He didn't answer immediately, just continued staring through the lenses. "Pete?" He lowered the binoculars slowly, his face pale. "There's something down there, at the edge of that clearing." I laughed nervously. "What? Did you spot Bigfoot or something?" He didn't laugh. Instead, he handed me the binoculars and pointed. "Look at the big redwood at the left edge of the clearing. There's something standing next to it." I raised the binoculars to my eyes, focusing where he indicated. At first, I saw nothing but forest and shadows. Then something moved. My stomach dropped. A dark figure stood beside a massive redwood, partially obscured by the trunk. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. Its body was covered in what looked like dark brown or black hair. The proportions were all wrong for a human, arms too long, torso too broad. As I watched, it reached up and effortlessly stripped a large piece of bark from the tree, tossing it to the ground. Then it bent forward, examining the exposed trunk, seemingly looking for insects or grubs. "Do you see it?" Pete whispered. My hands trembled, making the binoculars shake. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know." His voice was tight. I tried to focus better, to convince myself it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. But bears don't have shoulders like that. They don't have those proportions. This thing moved with purpose, with intelligence. "It's stripping the bark and looking for food," I said, my mouth dry. Pete took the binoculars back, his hands steadier than mine. "I can't believe what I'm seeing." Then it happened. A sound cut through the forest, a high-pitched screech that started low and rose to an ear-splitting pitch. It wasn't like any animal call I'd ever heard. Not a bird, not a mammal, nothing natural. Through the binoculars, Pete gasped. "It's looking up!" I grabbed for the binoculars. The creature had stopped foraging and was now standing fully upright, its head tilted back. It screeched again, the sound hitting me like a physical force. Then it began flailing its long arms, beating them against its chest and the tree beside it. The display lasted only seconds before the creature dropped forward onto all fours. What happened next burned itself permanently into my memory. The thing galloped, there's no other word for it, across the clearing with shocking speed. It moved like no human or bear could, covering ground with powerful strides. Its back remained flat, not hunched like a bear on all fours. Its long arms and legs propelled it forward with frightening efficiency, and it was heading in our direction. "It's coming this way," I whispered, watching as it disappeared into the trees at the far side of the clearing. Pete grabbed the binoculars from my hands and shoved them into his backpack. "We need to go, now." I stood frozen, my legs refusing to move. The reality of what we'd seen, what was potentially coming toward us, paralyzed me. Everything I'd believed about the natural world was crumbling. "Amanda!" Pete grabbed my hand, pulling me roughly. "Move!" His touch broke my trance. We turned and started back down the trail, moving as quickly as we dared on the uneven terrain. Another screech echoed through the forest, closer this time. The sound sent electricity through my limbs. "Faster!" Pete urged, his grip tight around my wrist. We weren't running yet, the trail was too steep and rocky, but we moved at a quick walk, constantly looking back over our shoulders. My heart pounded against my ribs. My breath came in sharp gasps. "Do you think it saw us?" I asked between breaths. "I don't know," Pete said. "Maybe it heard us talking." Another screech, this one from a different direction. The sound bounced off the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint. "It's circling us," I whispered, terror rising in my throat. As the trail leveled out, Pete pulled me into a jog. My hiking boots felt suddenly heavy, my backpack bouncing uncomfortably against my spine. We passed a large fallen redwood we'd photographed on the way up. We were making progress. The screeching continued intermittently. Sometimes it seemed farther away, sometimes closer. I couldn't tell if the creature was gaining on us or simply moving parallel to our path. "It knows these woods better than we do," Pete gasped as we ran. "If it wanted to catch us, it would have by now." The thought provided little comfort as we continued downhill, moving as fast as we safely could. My lungs burned, sweat dripped down my back despite the cool morning air. When we finally spotted the roof of our cabin through the trees, relief washed over me. We'd made it back to the resort. We burst from the tree line onto the property, startling an older couple having coffee on their porch. "You folks okay?" the man called out. Pete waved, trying to appear normal. "Just got a late start. Wanted to get back for breakfast." We hurried to our cabin, locking the door behind us. I collapsed onto a chair, my legs shaking violently. Pete paced the small room, running his hands through his hair. Did that really happen? Did we actually see what I think we saw? I nodded, unable to form words just yet. My mind replayed the image of the creature stripping bark, then galloping across the clearing with that unnatural gait. "It was," I finally managed. "A Sasquatch," Pete finished. "It had to be." We spent the rest of the day in the cabin, jumping at every sound outside. I kept expecting to hear that bone-chilling screech again, to see a hairy face peering through our windows. But nothing happened. That evening, we cautiously ventured to the resort's pub for dinner. Over beers, Pete quietly asked the bartender if people ever reported strange encounters in the woods. The man wiped a glass, eyeing us carefully. "What kind of strange?" "Unusual animals," Pete said evasively. "Things you wouldn't expect to see." The bartender set down his towel. "These forests are ancient. Lots of stories about what lives in the deep parts." He leaned closer. "You saw something today, didn't you?" I stared at my beer, avoiding his gaze. "Just curious," Pete replied, trying to sound casual. The bartender nodded slowly. "Fourth couple this season with that same look. Always after hiking that east trail." He resumed wiping glasses. "Whatever's out there, it's never bothered the resort. Seems to keep to itself, mostly." We didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin's wooden structure, every rustle in the trees outside had us sitting upright, listening intently. "Why didn't it catch us?" I whispered in the darkness. "You saw how fast it moved." Pete's hand found mine under the blankets. Maybe it was just trying to scare us away from its territory. "It could have caught us easily if it wanted to." The next morning, we checked out early, forfeiting our remaining nights. The resort owner didn't seem surprised. "Leaving so soon?" she asked as Pete handed over the cabin key. "Family emergency," I lied weakly. She nodded, not pressing for details. As she processed our credit card, she casually mentioned, "The forests have a way of showing people things they aren't prepared to see." We drove to Reading in silence, both lost in our thoughts. At the airport, waiting for our flight, Pete finally spoke about what had been bothering him most. "All my life I've believed in science, in what can be proven," he said, staring at the boarding gate. "But we saw something that supposedly doesn't exist." I nodded. "It changes everything, doesn't it? What else might be real that we dismiss as legend or myth?" That question followed us home to New York. We tried returning to our normal lives, work, friends, the rhythm of the city, but something fundamental had shifted. The world felt bigger, more mysterious, more dangerous. 2 months after our trip, Pete showed me a flyer for a convention about cryptozoology being held at a hotel in New Jersey. "We should go," he said. I hesitated only briefly before agreeing. The convention was nothing like I expected. Yes, there were some eccentric characters, but there were also serious researchers, wildlife biologists, and ordinary people like us who had experienced things they couldn't explain. We listened to lectures, examined blurry photographs, and eventually, in a small discussion group, shared our own story. A researcher recorded our account, asking detailed questions about the creature's appearance, movement, and vocalizations. He nodded frequently as we spoke. "Your description matches dozens of others from the Pacific Northwest," he told us, "especially the locomotion, that fluid gallop on all fours that no known primate exhibits." After that first convention, we found ourselves drawn into the community of Sasquatch researchers and enthusiasts. We attended more events, read books, joined online forums. Pete even built a website where people could anonymously share their encounters. Our New York friends thought we'd lost our minds. My parents worried we'd joined some kind of cult. But how could we explain that once you've seen something that shatters your understanding of reality, you can't just forget it and move on? Nearly 6 years have passed since that morning in the redwoods. We've since moved from New York to a smaller town in Pennsylvania, where we have more space and proximity to forests. Pete now works remotely, and I've switched to freelance work. Our living room bookshelf is filled with titles about cryptids, unexplained phenomena, and wilderness survival. We've returned to California twice, staying at different locations, but never venturing back to that specific trail. We've hiked in other forests across the country, always carrying better equipment, cameras with zoom lenses, audio recorders, the best binoculars money can buy. We haven't encountered another Sasquatch. Part of me is disappointed, but a larger part is relieved. The memory of that screech, the sight of that powerful body galloping across the clearing, still gives me nightmares. I respect these creatures now, whatever they are, and understand that they've managed to remain hidden for good reasons. Sometimes, when we're hiking a remote trail and the forest grows unusually quiet, I'll catch Pete scanning the trees with a wary expression. I know he's remembering, just as I am. I know we're both hoping we never see another one, even as we're secretly watching for signs. Because once you've glimpsed what hides in the shadows of our world, you can never stop looking. Do I wish we'd taken a photo that day? Sometimes. But in those moments of terror and disbelief, documentation was the furthest thing from our minds. All we wanted was to escape. And maybe that's how these creatures have remained hidden for so long. They know exactly how to ensure that when humans see them, the last thing they think about is reaching for a camera. Story 11. I still feel the grit of the riverbank under my worn sneakers when I think about it. The memory sits in my mind, clear as creek water after a spring rain, not faded like most childhood recollections. I'm Ellie Thompson, 44 years old now, living in the same northern Pennsylvania town of Millbrook where I grew up. I manage the local hardware store, Married 20 years to my high school sweetheart, Rick, with 2 teenagers who roll their eyes at my wild stories. But what happened that summer morning when I was 10 years old wasn't just a story. Back in 1989, I wasn't like the other girls in my class. While they played with Barbies and hosted tea parties, I collected fishing hooks and pocket knives. My dad called me his little ranger. Mum had passed when I was 6. Cancer took her quick, and Dad raised me the only way he knew how. He taught me to bait hooks, track animals, and identify every bird call in the Allegheny forest. That summer, Dad had made me a deal, 50 cents for every panfish I caught. It wasn't just about the money. Those fish meant Dad wouldn't have to cook after pulling double shifts at the sawmill. So every chance I got, I'd hop on my blue Schwinn bike, the one with the baseball cards clothespin to the spokes, and head down to Sycamore River. July 14th started like any other Saturday. I woke at dawn, pulled on my cut-off jeans and my Pittsburgh Pirates t-shirt, grabbed my tackle box and fishing rod, and snuck a package of strawberry Pop-Tarts from the pantry. Dad was still snoring in the recliner, where he'd fallen asleep watching late-night TV. I scribbled a note. Gone fishing, back with dinner, and pedaled away, while morning dew still clung to the spiderwebs between fence posts. The air smelled of pine and last night's rain. My bike tires splashed through puddles as I raced down Timber Lane, past the Johnsons' farm and the abandoned Tucker place. My spot was about 3 miles from town, where the river curved and created a calm pool that trapped fish. I'd found it earlier that summer, and it had quickly become my secret place. Not even Dad knew exactly where I fished. A ranger's got to have her own territory, I told him with all the seriousness a 10-year-old could muster. I arrived at my spot around 9:30, propped my bike against a sycamore tree, and unpacked my gear. The river gurgled peacefully. Across the water, about 40 yards wide at that point, dense forest grew right up to the riverbank. On my side, a small clearing gave way to similar woods behind me. The morning sun filtered through the trees, creating dappled patterns on the water's surface. By 10 a.m., I'd already caught 2 nice bluegills. They swam in circles in the metal bucket at my feet. I'd just stabbed another worm onto my hook, my fingers slick with dirt and worm guts, when movement across the river caught my eye. At first, I thought it was one of the Tucker boys. They sometimes hunted squirrels in these woods, though they weren't supposed to. The figure emerged from between 2 pine trees, walking along the opposite bank. But something wasn't right. It wasn't dressed like any kid I knew. It looked like it wore a black outfit that covered its whole body. And it moved. Strange. Not like a person at all. Its knees bent differently, backward almost, and its feet hit the ground in a way that made no sound. No splashing, no cracking twigs. Just silent, deliberate steps. I froze, hook dangling from my fingers, watching. The figure wasn't big. Maybe my height or slightly taller. It had long arms that swung oddly, too loose like they had extra joints. It moved with purpose but also curiosity, stopping occasionally to crouch and touch the water or pick up a stone. That's when it turned its head and looked directly at me. I didn't run. I didn't scream. Some instinct told me to stay perfectly still. Its face wasn't a face at all, at least not a human one. It was dark, with deep-set eyes that reflected the morning light. Not like animal eyes at night, no glow, but like polished black stones catching sunlight. Its nose was flat and wide, and I couldn't make out a mouth among the shaggy hair that covered its face. The creature didn't seem startled by me. It tilted its head slightly, like a dog trying to understand a strange sound. Then it simply went back to exploring the riverbank. For 5 full minutes, though it felt like hours, I watched it move along the water's edge. It picked up rocks, sniffed at fish carcasses left by other animals, and splashed its hand-like paws in the shallow water. Its movements reminded me of how my cousin's toddler explored the world, curious but without fear or hurry. The creature stopped at a fallen log that extended into the water. It crouched down on what I can only describe as haunches, Not sitting like a person, but not on all fours either. It dipped its hand into the water and pulled out something, maybe a crawfish or small fish. Whatever it was, the creature examined it closely before placing it in what must have been its mouth, hidden behind all that hair. That's when I heard it, a sound from deeper in the forest, not a bird call or any animal noise I recognized. It was a low, throaty grumble that vibrated through the air, almost like someone trying to clear phlegm from their throat, but deeper, more deliberate. The young creature's head snapped toward the sound, its body tensed. It remained perfectly still for several seconds, as if deciding what to do. Then it happened. The creature dropped to all fours. I expected it to run into the woods, but instead it gathered itself like a spring. In one fluid motion, without any visible effort, it leapt upward, straight up, and caught a branch at least 20 feet above the ground. The jump defied everything I knew about how bodies worked. There was no great pushing off, no visible strain. It was as if gravity loosened its hold for just that moment. The creature seemed to float upward, its limbs stretching and reaching, until its long fingers wrapped around the branch of a tall oak tree. Once secured, it pulled itself up with ease, then leaped from that branch to another, moving deeper into the forest with each jump. Within seconds, it had vanished completely, leaving only swaying branches as evidence it had been there at all. I sat on the riverbank, fishing rod forgotten in my lap, trying to process what I'd seen. My heart pounded against my ribs, but not from fear, from wonder, from the knowledge that I'd witnessed something impossible. After several minutes, I gathered my things, dumped the fish back into the river, something I'd never done before, and pedaled home faster than I'd ever ridden. The entire way back, I kept checking over my shoulder, though not out of fear. I wanted to see it again. When I burst through our front door, Dad was at the kitchen table drinking coffee and doing the crossword. "Caught anything good, Ellie Belly?" he asked without looking up. I opened my mouth to tell him everything, then stopped. The words backed up in my throat. What would I say? That I saw some kind of monkey-child creature jump 20 feet into a tree? That it had looked at me with eyes too knowing for an animal, but too wild for a human? "Just some small ones," I said finally. "Threw 'em back to grow bigger." Dad nodded absently, penciling in another answer. I didn't go fishing the next day, or the day after. When I finally returned to the river the following weekend, I sat watching the opposite bank for hours, but the creature never reappeared. As weeks passed, I told myself maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it had been one of the Tucker boys playing a prank, wearing some kind of costume, but deep down I knew what I'd seen. That fall, when Mrs. Harlow assigned a project on local wildlife, I chose to research unconfirmed species of Pennsylvania. The school library had exactly one book with a small section on Bigfoot sightings in the Appalachian Range. The descriptions matched what I'd seen, except most reported creatures were much larger. Adults, I realized. I had seen a young one. The following summer, I convinced Dad to take me camping near my fishing spot. We spent 3 weekends there, but I never caught another glimpse of the creature. When I turned 12, I asked for a camera for my birthday and started documenting everything I saw in the woods. Raccoon tracks, unusual broken branches, anything that seemed out of place. Dad thought it was just an extension of my tomboy phase. By 13, I'd stopped mentioning it to anyone. Bobby Larkin had overheard me telling my best friend Susan about it and spent a week making monkey noises whenever I walked by. After that, I kept the memory locked up tight, like a precious stone I'd examine only when alone. Life moved on. High school, community college, marriage to Rick, who I met working at the lumberyard office. 2 kids, Sam and Jessica. A mortgage, PTA meetings, normal life stuff. But I never stopped wondering. Never stopped looking at the woods differently than other people did. I took the kids hiking from the time they could walk, taught them to fish in the same river, always kept a disposable camera in my backpack just in case. Sometimes I'd hear rustling in the underbrush that didn't sound like deer or bear. Once, when Sam was 7, he claimed he saw a big, hairy man watching us from behind a fallen tree. Rick laughed it off as an overactive imagination. I didn't. Last year, Jessica, my 16-year-old, came home from school talking about a podcast on cryptids she'd discovered. "Mom, they talked about Bigfoot sightings right here in Pennsylvania," she said, eyes wide with the delight of secret knowledge. "Isn't that crazy?" I nodded, feeling that old familiar tightness in my chest. "People report all kinds of things in these woods." "You don't actually believe that stuff, do you?" She laughed, already pulling out her phone to text friends. I shrugged. The woods hold all kinds of secrets. She rolled her eyes in that particular teenage way and left me standing in the kitchen, memories swirling like autumn leaves in my mind. This spring, I read about a research group investigating Bigfoot sightings across the Appalachian Range. They set up cameras, collected testimonies, analyzed footprints. I considered contacting them, then decided against it. Some experiences aren't meant to be dissected by strangers with scientific equipment and skeptical minds. What I saw that day wasn't just a creature. It was a glimpse into something beyond our everyday understanding of the world. The way it moved, that impossible leap, no known animal moves that way. Yet it wasn't supernatural either. It ate, it explored, it responded to a call. It was flesh and blood. Sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I talk out loud, hoping whatever I saw might be listening. I tell it about my life, my children, my questions. I ask if it remembers the little girl with the fishing rod who watched it from across the river 34 years ago. The woods never answer with words, but sometimes, when the wind dies down and the birds go suddenly quiet, I feel watched. Not in a threatening way, more like a distant relative checking in on family. I've researched everything I can find on Bigfoot sightings. Some say they're just undiscovered primates. Others claim they can turn invisible or travel between dimensions. I don't know what to believe, but I know what I saw. The creature's movements, especially that leap, weren't just unusual. They seemed to defy the physical laws I understood. Do they migrate with the seasons, like some researchers suggest? Do they have language, culture, families? Can they somehow hide themselves from human detection? These questions keep me awake some nights, staring at the ceiling while Rick snores beside me. Last month, I took my old bike out of the garage, oiled the chain, and rode those same 3 miles to my fishing spot. The trail was more overgrown now, but still passable. The riverbank had eroded in places, the clearing slightly smaller than in my memory, but the sycamore tree still stood where I used to prop my bike. I sat on a flat rock by the water's edge, watching the opposite bank as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Nothing emerged from the tree line. No strange creature appeared to investigate the riverbank. But as I prepared to leave, something caught my eye. Across the river, laid carefully on a prominent rock, sat a small pile of river stones, 5 of them, stacked in a perfect tower. I stood frozen, staring at the stack. It hadn't been there when I arrived, and no human had crossed the river. I would have heard the splashing. The stones remained balanced, impossibly precise, catching the midday sun. A message, perhaps, or just a coincidence. I didn't touch my bike for several long minutes. I simply watched the woods, feeling that same wonder I'd experienced at age 10. Then I did something I'd never done before. I raised my hand in a slow wave toward the forest. Nothing moved, no branches swayed, no creature appeared. But as I finally turned to leave, the top stone from the stack toppled off, landing with a distinct plop in the river. I smiled all the way home. Story 12. I was 5 years old when I first saw them. That was back in 1988, when we lived in my stepdad Rick's house in Pinewood Creek. It wasn't a fancy place, just a regular 2-story house with white siding that needed a fresh coat of paint. What made it special to me was the long gravel driveway that stretched from the road all the way up to our garage. That driveway was my racetrack, my highway, my entire world on summer afternoons. Mom and Rick had gotten married just a few months after the divorce. Dad moved to Arizona, and we barely heard from him anymore. The move to Rick's place happened fast. I didn't have many friends yet, which left me with plenty of time to play by myself. My prized possession was a green G.I. Joe Power Wheels, an electric vehicle just my size that could hit a whopping 5 miles per hour if the battery was fully charged. The day I first saw one of them was in late June. The air hung heavy with that Northern California heat, the kind that makes everything smell like warm pine needles and dry grass. I was racing up and down the driveway, making engine noises with my mouth that were louder than the actual motor. Rick had stacked freshly chopped wood near the basketball hoop at the end of the driveway, and I was using it as my turnaround point. On my 5th or 6th lap down the driveway, something caught my eye. A dark shape ducked behind the woodpile. I slowed the power wheels, my thumb easing off the plastic accelerator pedal. "Hello?" I called out, expecting maybe it was Rick playing a game. No answer came, just the soft rustling of leaves in the trees that lined our property. I turned the power wheels around and headed back toward the woodpile, curiosity overriding any caution a 5-year-old might possess. As I approached, I saw it. The forest person. It moved fast, bursting out from behind the stack of logs. It didn't run like people run. Its movement was all wrong, a kind of hunched, zigzagging motion as it crossed the patch of grass between the driveway and the tree line. Its arms swung differently, longer somehow, and its knees bent at angles I'd never seen on a person. The thing disappeared into the trees before I could get a good look at its face. But I saw enough. It wasn't wearing clothes. Its body was covered in dark hair or fur that looked matted in some places. And it was built strange. Not giant like a monster in movies, but definitely bigger than me, with a top-heavy upper body and muscles that stuck out in lumps underneath whatever was covering it. I sat in my power wheels, frozen. The plastic steering wheel felt slippery under my sweaty hands. After a few seconds, I stomped on the accelerator and raced back to the house. "Mom!" I shouted as I burst through the screen door into the kitchen. "I saw a forest person!" Mom was at the sink washing dishes. She turned, her hands dripping soap suds onto the linoleum floor. "A what, honey?" she asked, reaching for a dish towel. "A forest person. By the woodpile. It ran funny into the trees." She smiled that smile adults give kids when they think we're being cute. "Sounds like you found an imaginary friend." "No, it was real. I saw it." "That's nice, sweetie. Why don't you wash up for lunch? I made grilled cheese." I knew that tone. It was her end-of-discussion voice. I trudged to the bathroom, stood on my plastic step stool, and washed my hands, all while looking out the small window that faced the woods. The forest person was out there. I knew it wasn't imaginary. I'd seen it with my own eyes. For the next couple of days, I stayed close to the house. I rode my power wheels, but I didn't go all the way down to the woodpile. Instead, I made tight circles in the wider part of the driveway near the garage. Mom noticed and asked if something was wrong, but I just shrugged. I didn't want another imagination lecture. 4 days after my first sighting, I got brave again. The memory had faded just enough that I convinced myself maybe it had been a deer or something normal. I charged up my power wheels and headed down the full length of the driveway. The day was cooler, with grey clouds hanging low in the sky. A light breeze made the pine trees sway and creak. I drove slowly, my eyes constantly scanning the woods on either side of the driveway. I reached the woodpile without incident and turned around to head back up toward the house. That's when I felt it, the feeling of being watched. It hit me like a physical sensation, a prickling along the back of my neck that made me stop the vehicle dead in its tracks. I looked toward the trees on my right, and there it was. Not moving this time, just standing about 20 feet into the forest, partially hidden behind a thick pine trunk. It was perfectly still, but I could make out its shape in the shadows, the broad shoulders, the slightly hunched posture, and its eye. I could see one eye clearly, catching what little daylight filtered through the trees. It was large, much larger than a human eye, and completely black like a marble. No white parts, just a glossy black sphere fixed directly on me. We stared at each other. I don't know how long. Time seemed to stop. My heart pounded so loud I was sure the creature could hear it. The thing didn't blink, not once. It just watched me with that unnerving black eye. Some instinct finally kicked in, some ancient part of my brain that knew maintaining eye contact was dangerous. I looked down at my hands on the wheel and pressed the accelerator, heading back toward the house at the power wheel's top speed, which suddenly felt painfully slow. I glanced back once. The creature hadn't moved. It was still watching me from the same spot, half hidden behind the tree. I didn't tell Mom this time. What was the point? She'd just say I was making things up again. Instead, I parked my power wheels in the garage and went inside to watch cartoons, trying to forget those black eyes. But 20 minutes later, Mum burst through the front door, her face white. She locked the door behind her, then rushed through the house, checking all the windows. Her hands shook as she turned the lock on the sliding glass door. "What's wrong, Mom?" I asked, muting the TV. "Nothing, honey. Just stay inside, okay?" She reached for the phone on the wall and dialed quickly. I could hear her talking in a hushed, urgent voice. "Yes, I'd like to report an intruder. 148 Pinewood Drive. I saw someone running across my backyard into the woods. No, I don't know who. They weren't wearing... Yes, I have a child. Please hurry." 2 police officers came. They were both tall men with thick moustaches and heavy belts that jingled when they walked. They searched the yard and the edge of the woods with flashlights. Even though it was still daytime, they found nothing. "Probably just a hiker who got lost," the older officer told my mum. "Or maybe some teenager playing a prank. We'll drive by a few extra times tonight, but I wouldn't worry too much, Mum." Mum nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe him. That night, she pushed my dresser in front of my bedroom window before tucking me in. "Just for extra safety," she said with a forced smile. I wanted to ask if she'd seen the forest person too, but I was afraid of the answer, so I just hugged my stuffed dinosaur tighter and pretended to fall asleep quickly. Life went on. Days passed, then weeks. I still rode my power wheels, but never alone. Mom or Rick would sit on the porch steps watching me. I never went all the way down to the woodpile anymore. The summer faded into fall, and fall into winter. The power wheels got put away as rain, and occasional snow made the driveway too muddy for driving. I didn't see the forest people again for a long time, years in fact. I almost convinced myself that maybe Mom was right. Maybe it had been my imagination after all. Almost. Then came the night with Julie, my babysitter. I was 11 by then. Julie was 17, the daughter of Mom's co-worker. She had long red hair and always smelled like strawberry gum. She was watching me while Mom and Rick went to some work dinner. It was a Friday in March, and we were playing board games at the kitchen table. The kitchen window faced the backyard and the woods beyond. It was dark outside, but the light from inside created a perfect mirror effect on the glass. I could see our reflections, me concentrating on the game pieces, Julie checking her watch and yawning. "Your move, Squirt," Julie said, popping her gum. I reached for the dice, but my hand froze midway. Behind our reflections, I saw movement in the yard. 2 dark shapes, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with that same strange gait I remembered from years before. "Julie," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the window, "there's somebody outside." "Yeah, right. Nice try, but I'm not falling for..." She turned toward the window, and the words died in her throat. The shapes had stopped moving. They stood at the edge of our yard, just where the grass met the forest. And they were looking directly at us through the window. Even from this distance, I could see the gleam of those large, dark eyes reflecting our kitchen light. Julie knocked her chair over as she jumped to her feet. She grabbed my arm so hard it hurt and pulled me away from the window. "Get down!" she hissed, dragging me to the floor. She crawled to the phone, her hands shaking as she dialed. "Police! There are people in the backyard at 148 Pinewood Drive. 2 men just standing there watching us. I'm the babysitter. Yes, we're inside with the doors locked. Please hurry." We stayed on the kitchen floor, backs against the cabinets, until we heard sirens in the distance. Julie kept her arm around me the whole time, her body trembling against mine. When the police came, they found nothing again. No footprints, even though the ground was soft from recent rain. No broken branches or disturbed underbrush. Nothing. "Probably just shadows from the trees," one officer suggested. "I know what I saw," Julie said, her voice steady despite her pale face. After the police left, Julie called her parents to pick her up. She refused to babysit for us again. Mom and Rick didn't question what happened that night, not the way they had when I was 5. Something had changed. They installed motion detector lights all around the house. Rick bought a shotgun that he kept in their bedroom closet. Mom stopped letting me play outside alone, even in broad daylight. 2 years later, when I was 13, Rick got a job offer in New York City. We moved within a month. I remember feeling nothing but relief as we pulled out of the driveway for the last time, the U-Haul trailer rattling behind our station wagon. I didn't look back at the woods. Living in New York was different. Concrete, noise, people everywhere. No forests, no quiet driveways, no watching eyes from the trees. I almost forgot about the forest people. Almost. But some nights, I'd wake up in our cramped apartment with the sensation of being watched. I'd lie still, heart pounding until dawn broke, and the city noises reassured me I was far from Pinewood Creek. It wasn't until I was in college that I stumbled across an online forum where people shared stories similar to mine. Tales of encounters with creatures that weren't quite human, that moved wrong, that watched from the edges of forests with 2 large eyes. Some called them Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but those names conjured images of giant monsters from tabloid headlines. One term stood out to me: wood apes. It fit what I'd seen. Not mythical monsters, but something real. Something that walked a line between the world I knew and something else entirely. The name lacked the sensationalism of Bigfoot, but acknowledged their otherness, their connection to the forests, their not quite human but not quite animal nature. I've never told this story publicly before. Even now, sitting in my apartment in Chicago, thousands of miles and decades removed from those encounters, my hands shake as I type this. The memory of those black, unblinking eyes still visits me in dreams. I don't know what the wood apes are. I don't know why they watched me, why they seemed interested in a 5-year-old on a plastic G.I. Joe Power Wheels. I don't know if they meant harm or were simply curious. But I know what I saw, and I know Mom saw something too, though we've never really talked about it. Sometimes I think about that house in Pinewood Creek. I wonder if the family living there now has seen the watchers in the woods. I wonder if their children play in that long driveway, blissfully unaware of the black eyes tracking their movements from the tree line. And I wonder if the wood apes are still there, waiting and watching, from just beyond the edge of where the yard meets the forest. Story 13. My heart still pounds when I remember that August. 30 years gone, but the memory stays sharp as a thorn. I was 16 that summer of '92, full of that restless energy that makes you feel both invincible and bored all at once. My parents owned this old cabin in Whispering Pines, deep in Mason County, Washington. It was our ritual. 2 weeks every August, no TV, just trees, trails, and that perfect rope swing hanging over the creek. That summer, my best friend Ethan came along. His folks were going through a rough divorce, and my mom figured getting him out of town would do him good. Ethan and I had been tight since 5th grade, both of us gangly, awkward kids who found refuge in comic books and horror movies. By 16, we'd grown into our limbs somewhat, though Ethan still had that twitchy energy that made teachers eye him with suspicion. August 14th started like any other day at the cabin. The heat pressed down heavy, the kind that makes your t-shirt stick to your back before noon. We'd spent most of the morning helping my dad stack firewood near the shed, and by early afternoon, we'd earned our freedom. "You boys back before dark," Mom called as we headed down the trail, towels slung over our shoulders. "And watch for snakes." The rope swing was about 200 yards downhill from the cabin, accessible only by a steep trail that switched back through dense forest. It was our favorite spot, a wide, deep pool in the creek, cold enough to make your teeth ache, with a thick rope hanging from a sturdy Douglas fir. We'd spent half our vacation there already, perfecting cannonballs and trying to outdo each other with flips. That afternoon, we had the place to ourselves. The nearest cabin was a quarter-mile away, and most folks stuck to the designated swimming areas closer to the main road. This was our private paradise. We swam until our fingers pruned, taking turns swinging out on the rope and dropping into the deepest part of the pool with whoops that echoed through the trees. The sun filtered through the canopy, dappling the water with gold. Perfect, normal, safe. As the light began to shift, turning everything amber and long-shadowed, I checked my watch. 6:45. "We should head back," I said, pulling myself onto the rocky bank. "Mom'll have dinner ready soon." Ethan nodded, slicking back his wet hair. "Race you to the top?" I snorted. "Last time we did that, you twisted your ankle, and I had to practically carry you back." "Whatever," he grinned, reaching for his t-shirt draped over a low branch. That's when we heard it. A sound from the north, maybe 40 or 50 yards away. Footsteps, heavy but with an odd rhythm. I froze, t-shirt halfway over my head. "You hear that?" Ethan nodded, suddenly still. The footsteps continued, distinctly bipedal but with an unnatural cadence, almost like someone hopping from foot to foot, but slower, more deliberate. The stride length seemed impossibly long. "Probably some hiker," Ethan whispered, but his eyes darted nervously. I cupped my hands around my mouth. "Hello? Who's there?" The footsteps paused briefly, then continued, heavier now. Branches snapped under whatever weight was approaching. "Hey!" I called again, louder this time. "This is private property." Nothing but more footsteps, closer now. A cold feeling settled in my gut, completely at odds with the warm evening air. "We should go," Ethan muttered, jamming his feet into his sneakers without bothering to tie them. I nodded, scanning the thick undergrowth. The hillside was covered in vine maples and dense brush that blocked our view in that direction. All we could hear was the steady approach. Step, pause, step, pause, and the sound of vegetation being pushed aside. My fingers fumbled with my shoelaces, suddenly clumsy with adrenaline. 30 yards away now. 25. The footsteps grew unmistakably closer. Then, about 40 yards away, a vine maple branch swept aside with deliberate force. What stood there stopped my breath mid-inhale. The creature was tall, 7 feet at least, with shoulders twice as broad as any man I'd ever seen. Its body was packed with muscle that moved strangely beneath skin that looked almost black in the fading light, covered with thin dark brown hair. But it was the face that carved itself permanently into my memory. The features were arranged in a way that was almost human, but horribly wrong. Its face resembled a gorilla somewhat, but with a nose that was unnaturally wide, nostrils that faced downward. The eyes, God, the eyes were deep set, and amber-colored, reflecting the evening light with an intelligence that was far more terrifying than if they'd been vacant. For one endless second, we stared at each other. The creature's expression shifted slightly. Surprise, perhaps, at finding us there. Its massive chest expanded with a deep breath. Ethan broke first, a strangled sound escaping his throat. He scrambled backward, losing his footing on the rocky bank. That broke the spell. I grabbed his arm, yanking him up, and we turned together, abandoning our towels as we lunged for the trail. The hillside was steep, forcing us to grab at branches and roots to haul ourselves upward. My feet slipped on pine needles, sending me sliding backward before I caught myself on an exposed root. Behind us came the sound of pursuit, heavy footfalls and the crack of breaking branches. "Go, go, go!" I gasped, pushing Ethan ahead of me. We scrambled up the elk trails that crisscrossed the main path, taking any route that led upward toward the cabin. My lungs burned, legs trembling with effort and fear. I didn't dare look back. The sound of pursuit continued for about 30 seconds, just long enough for us to reach the first switchback before gradually fading. Still, we didn't slow down. We climbed that hillside faster than I ever had before, gasping and stumbling, but never stopping. When the cabin's back porch finally came into view, we sprinted the last 50 yards and burst through the screen door. My mom looked up from setting the table, startled. "Boys, what on earth?" "Lock the doors," I panted, slamming the main door shut behind us. "There's something out there." Dad appeared from the living room, newspaper in hand. "What's going on?" Ethan collapsed into a kitchen chair, his face ghost white. I realized I was shaking, my wet shoes leaving puddles on the linoleum. We saw... I swallowed hard. There was something by the creek, following us. What, a bear? Dad moved to the window, peering out at the darkening forest. "No." My voice sounded strange even to myself. "It was walking. On two legs." Mom's face creased with worry. "Marcus, you're scaring me. What exactly did you see?" I tried to describe it. The height, the muscles, the face, but the words felt inadequate. With each detail, my parents exchanged increasingly skeptical glances. "Probably a black bear," Dad concluded. "They sometimes stand on their hind legs. In the dim light, your imagination filled in the rest." "It wasn't a bear," Ethan said suddenly. His voice was flat, certain. "It watched us. It understood." Dad sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Look, I'll take the rifle and check around the property, but I'm telling you, wild animals sometimes don't go out there." I grabbed his arm with more force than I intended. The fear in my eyes must have convinced him because he nodded slowly. "All right, we'll stay in tonight. I'll check things out in the morning." That night was the longest of my life. We ate dinner in tense silence, the usual cabin sounds, creaking wood, wind in the trees, suddenly sinister. After eating, Dad methodically checked every window and door lock while Mom tried to distract us with a card game none of us could focus on. I kept seeing that face, those eyes, whenever I closed my own. We slept in the main room that night, Ethan and me on the pull-out couch, my parents in their nearby bedroom with the door open. Dad propped his hunting rifle against the wall within easy reach. I don't think any of us slept more than minutes at a time. Morning brought watery sunlight and a semblance of normality. Dad and his friend Carl from the neighboring cabin walked down to the creek, armed with rifles and skepticism. They found our abandoned towels and sneaker prints in the mud, but nothing else. No unusual tracks, no broken branches big enough to suggest anything larger than a deer had passed through. "Your imagination got the better of you boys," Dad concluded over lunch. "Happens to everyone in these woods sometimes. The light plays tricks." But his smile didn't reach his eyes, and I noticed he kept checking the tree line from the kitchen window. We stayed 3 more days, but everything had changed. Ethan and I refused to return to the creek, instead sticking close to the cabin, jumping at every sound. My parents, sensing our genuine terror, didn't push. On the third night, during a heavy rainstorm, we heard something moving around the cabin, circling, pausing, circling again. Dad stood by the window with his rifle for hours, but in the darkness and rain, he couldn't see anything. The next morning, we packed up and left, a week earlier than planned. Back home in Olympia, life gradually returned to normal. School started, and the memory of that day began to feel like a shared nightmare. Ethan and I talked about it less and less, though sometimes I'd catch him staring into space, his fingers absently tracing patterns on his desk, and I knew he was thinking about it too. That fall, I researched everything I could find about Mason County's forests. I read about Bigfoot sightings, though what we saw wasn't quite the shaggy, lumbering creature from the Patterson film. I found old newspaper clippings about missing hikers and unexplained sounds. Most were easily dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but some, a report from 1976 describing a family's encounter with a large bipedal creature near our very same creek. A Forest Service employee's documented discovery of a makeshift shelter built far too high in a tree for human access made my skin crawl. My parents sold the cabin the following spring. They cited financial reasons, but I knew better. Something had changed for them too that August. Ethan's family moved to Portland after his parents' divorce was finalized, and we gradually lost touch, as teenagers often do. But 10 years later, during my second year of law school, I got a call out of the blue. "Marcus, it's Ethan." His voice sounded older, rougher. "I'm in Seattle for a conference. Thought we could grab a beer." We met at a bar near Pike Place Market. He looked good, bearded, confident, wearing a shirt with a tech company logo. We caught up on careers, relationships, mutual friends from high school. But I knew why he'd really called. After his second beer, he leaned forward. "I went back there, you know, to Whispering Pines." My stomach tightened. Why would you do that? Had to. Couldn't let it own me forever. He picked at the label on his bottle. The cabin's still there. Different color, new owner, but it's the same place. I hiked down to the creek. And? The word came out as a whisper. Ethan shook his head. "Nothing. Just a creek. The rope swing's gone." He paused, taking a long drink. But the ranger station had a notice posted. 3 hikers gone missing in the past year, all from the same general area. Jesus. Yeah. He met my eyes. "Marcus, what do you think we saw that day?" I'd had years to consider this question. I don't know, but it was real. Whatever it was real. He nodded, relief crossing his features. I've told that story to exactly 2 people in my life. My ex-wife thought I needed therapy. My brother asked what drugs we were on. I haven't told anyone, I admitted, not even my wife. We sat in silence for a moment, the bar noise washing around us. "You ever going back?" he finally asked. "No," I said immediately. "Never." The certainty in my voice made him smile grimly. "Yeah, me neither." We parted with awkward hugs and promises to keep in touch. Promises we both knew we probably wouldn't keep. Our connection wasn't friendship anymore. It was a shared trauma. A mutual witness to something that didn't fit in the world as we understood it. That was the last time I saw Ethan. I heard through old classmates that he died 5 years ago. Car accident on a rainy Oregon highway. I sent flowers to the funeral but didn't attend. I'm 46 now, living in Chicago with my family, about as far from the forests of Washington as I could reasonably get. Most days, I don't think about what happened. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, even just the manicured forest preserves outside the city, I find myself scanning the trees, listening for that distinctive, uneven footfall, and I wonder if, somewhere in those dense Mason County forests, it remembers us too. Story 14. The smell hit me first. Even through closed windows, it invaded my station wagon like some physical force, a putrid mixture of rotting meat, wet dog, and something else I couldn't place. Something that didn't belong in this world. My headlights cut through the October darkness on Horseshoe Island, revealing nothing but empty road ahead. But I knew something was out there. I could feel it watching. My name is Derek. On October 15th, 1993, I saw something on this island that changed me forever. I'd been homeless for about 8 months by then. Lost my construction job in Tacoma when the housing market tanked, couldn't make rent, and eventually found myself living in my 1984 Ford Country Squire station wagon. It wasn't ideal, but I made it work. Horseshoe Island became my temporary home, remote enough that the locals didn't bother me much, with a campground where I could use the showers and bathrooms. The ferry ride cost money I didn't have to spare, but at least here I could park without getting hassled by cops. That night started like any other. I'd spent the day doing odd jobs for a farmer on the north side of the island, clearing brush for cash under the table. By 11:30 p.m., I was driving toward the campground showers, keeping to the 35 mph speed limit. Horseshoe Island was crawling with deer, and I couldn't afford to hit one. The wagon was all I had left. The radio played softly, some late-night call-in show discussing conspiracy theories. I normally didn't buy that garbage, but out here in the darkness, the voices kept me company. My headlights illuminated the cracked asphalt road as I approached the Grange Hall intersection. A small hill rose before me, with a hairpin turn just beyond it. I'd made this drive dozens of times before. I eased off the gas as I crested the hill. My headlights swept across the large pasture that bordered the right side of the road. Something reflected the light back at me. "What the hell?" I muttered, squinting through the windshield. At first I thought it was just one of the horses that usually grazed there during the day. Maybe it had gotten out of the barn, or perhaps it was a tree stump I'd never noticed before. The object stood motionless in the moonlit field, a dark silhouette against the lighter grass. I slowed even more as I approached the turn, my headlights still trained on the object. That's when it moved. The stump turned its head and looked directly at me. My foot instinctively hit the brake. The wagon lurched to a near stop in the middle of the road. My heart pounded against my ribs as I tried to process what I was seeing. It was tall, too tall. The field sat 3 to 4 feet below road level, yet this thing towered over my car. Its head must have been 8, maybe 9 feet off the ground, and it was watching me. I couldn't make out details in the darkness, just a massive silhouette with a distinctly head-like shape on top. As I started to roll forward again, the thing moved. It walked, no, it strode, parallel to my car, keeping pace with my slow-moving vehicle. The smell intensified. It burned my nose and made my eyes water. I hit the button to roll up the windows tighter, but they were already closed. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. The creature took long, powerful strides, each one covering more ground than seemed possible. I was driving at maybe 10 mph, and it matched my speed with what looked like minimal effort. Its arms, if that's what they were, swung with each step, abnormally long and hanging far too low. My headlights couldn't reach it properly from this angle, but moonlight silhouetted its massive frame. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, probably more considering it was walking in the lower field. Its body appeared bulky, covered in something dark that could have been clothing or something else. The fear hit me in waves. My skin felt electric, covered in goosebumps, so pronounced they hurt. My mouth went dry. I couldn't swallow. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. The creature started moving faster than my car. That's when real panic set in. I stopped the wagon completely, terrified it would leap over the rusted barbed wire fence that separated the field from the road. The engine idled roughly as I watched the thing continue walking along the fence line. It moved with purpose, heading toward the corner where the road turned sharply right. "Go," I told myself. "Fucking go." I put the car in gear again and followed at a distance, creeping forward with my high beams on. I needed to see what it was doing. I needed to know if it was coming for me. When it reached the corner of the fence line, the creature stopped. For a moment it just stood there, a massive dark shape against the night sky. Then, with horrifying ease, it simply stepped over the 4-foot barbed wire fence as if it were stepping over a garden hose. My breath caught in my throat. I watched as it crossed the road maybe 50 yards ahead of me, moving with that same unnatural gait. Its head turned slightly in my direction as it crossed, and though I couldn't see its eyes in the darkness, I felt its gaze lock onto mine. Something primitive inside me screamed to run, to back up and floor it in the opposite direction. Instead, I sat frozen, watching as it disappeared into the trees on the other side of the road. The spell broke. I slammed the wagon into reverse, backed up frantically until I found a spot wide enough to turn around, then gunned the engine. The old station wagon protested but surged forward as I raced toward the campground. My mind raced faster than the car. What the fuck was that thing? Not a bear. Bears don't walk like that. Not a person. No person is that big. The smell lingered in my nostrils, triggering some instinctual fear response I didn't know I had. I reached the campground in record time, screeching into the parking lot by the shower building. There were no other cars, no other people, just me and the darkness and whatever that thing was out in the woods. I sat in the car for several minutes, engine running, lights on, trying to steady my breathing. I needed a shower. I'd been working all day and smelled like sweat and dirt, but the thought of walking across the dark parking lot to the shower building made my stomach turn. "It didn't follow you," I said aloud, trying to convince myself. "It went the other way." Finally, I grabbed my toiletry bag, locked the car, and sprinted to the shower building. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed loudly, but the familiar sound was comforting. I showered in record time, never turning my back to the door, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. Clean but still terrified, I ran back to my car and peeled out of the campground. I drove straight to the ferry dock, but the last ferry had left hours ago. I parked in the well-lit waiting area and locked all the doors, keeping the engine running for heat. I didn't sleep that night. Every shadow seemed to move. Every noise made me flinch. I kept thinking about how easily that thing had stepped over the fence, how it had turned to look at me as it crossed the road, how it knew I was watching. As soon as the first ferry arrived the next morning, I drove on board and left Horseshoe Island. I needed to clear my head, to convince myself that exhaustion and darkness had played tricks on me. But I knew what I'd seen, and I needed to know if anyone else had seen it too. I returned to the island around noon. In daylight, the place seemed different. Peaceful farmland, scattered houses, nothing sinister. I drove back to the spot where I'd seen the creature, pulling over at the hairpin turn to examine the fence. My heart sank. The fence was pushed down where the creature had crossed. 3 steel posts were bent at 45-degree angles, and the barbed wire was stretched and broken. Whatever had crossed there was heavy and real. I took photos with the disposable camera I kept in my glove compartment. Not that anyone would believe me, but I needed proof for myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Later that day, I stopped at the island's only gas station to fill up before heading back to the ferry. The old man behind the counter, Walt according to his name tag, asked if I was staying long this time. "Just passing through," I said, counting out crumpled bills for the gas. Then, before I could stop myself, "Hey, you ever hear about anything strange in the woods here? Any local legends or stories?" Walt's hand paused on the register. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "What kind of strange are you talking about?" I hesitated. "I don't know. Large animals, maybe? Something unusual?" Walt's eyes narrowed slightly. "You saw something." It wasn't a question. "I don't know what I saw," I admitted. "Last night, by the Grange Hall intersection, something big." Walt sighed and looked around the empty store before leaning forward. "There's 3 or 4 of them living on the island," he said, his voice low. "Been here longer than any of us." A chill ran down my spine. 3 or 4 of what? Walt shrugged. "Don't have a name for 'em. Most folks who've lived here a while know to stay out of certain areas after dark. The newer residents, they think we're superstitious fools." He handed me my change. "Whatever you saw, consider yourself lucky you were in your car." I left the gas station with more questions than answers. 3 or 4 of them, living on the island. The thought made me sick with fear. I didn't want to believe Walt, but I couldn't deny what I'd seen. The image of that massive figure stepping over the fence was burned into my memory. The smell still haunted me. I took the next ferry off Horseshoe Island and never returned at night again. I found a new place to park my wagon in Tacoma, under a highway overpass with plenty of streetlights and other homeless folks nearby. Sometimes safety comes in numbers. Over the years, I've tried researching what I saw. Bigfoot stories don't match. The smell was different, and the way it moved was wrong. Wendigo legends come closer, but those are from much further east. The internet gave me new avenues to search, but no answers. Sometimes I dream about it. In my dreams, I'm not in my car. I'm standing in that field, and the creature is walking toward me, its face still hidden in shadow. I always wake up before I see its features, my body covered in sweat, that same putrid smell somehow filling my bedroom. I've told this story exactly 4 times in the 29 years since it happened. Most people don't believe me. Some suggest I was tired or drunk or hallucinating. Maybe they're right. Maybe my mind manufactured a monster out of moonlight and exhaustion. But I know what I saw on Horseshoe Island. I know what bent those fence posts. And somewhere deep inside, I know those creatures are still there, walking through moonlit fields, watching the roads for headlights cresting the hills. And sometimes, on cold October nights, I swear I catch a whiff of that same putrid smell, even hundreds of miles from Horseshoe Island. It makes me wonder if they've spread, if they're not confined to that island anymore, if one of them might be watching me right now, waiting for the right moment to step out of the darkness, because the most terrifying part of my encounter wasn't seeing the creature. It was the unmistakable feeling that it had been watching for me, waiting for me, that our meeting wasn't random at all, and that next time a car window and a barbed wire fence won't be enough to keep it away. Story 15. The headlights cut through the darkness as I guided my Ford pickup along the winding road. September nights in Washington come early, and by 8:15 p.m. we were already wrapped in complete darkness. My cousin Trevor sat beside me, fiddling with the map and occasionally checking his phone for service. "I think we missed the turn back there, Mike," Trevor said, squinting at the paper map illuminated by the dashboard lights. "Damn it," I muttered. "I thought the campground was right after the bridge." We had left my apartment in Renton around 7:30 p.m., later than planned. The trip to Jarrell Cove State Park on Harin Island should have been straightforward, south on I-5, then west toward the island. But now, having crossed the narrow bridge onto Harin, we found ourselves on an unfamiliar stretch of road surrounded by dense forest. "There should be a place to turn around up ahead," I said, leaning forward and peering through the windshield. The road narrowed further, trees pressing in from both sides. My high beams cut a bright swath through the darkness, illuminating about 50 feet of pavement ahead. Trevor had stopped talking, his focus now on finding our bearings on the crumpled map. I slowed the truck as we approached a slight bend. The headlights swept across the roadside, and then, Jesus Christ! I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the damp pavement. There, at the edge of the forest, stood something that didn't belong. Not in Washington, not anywhere I knew. "What the hell is that?" Trevor's voice cracked. The high beams fully illuminated it now. A massive bipedal figure stood with its side facing us, one foot already raised as if it had been caught mid-step up the hillside. For 5 eternal seconds, it remained frozen in the harsh glare of my headlights. I grew up in rural Idaho. I've hunted since I was 12. I know what a bear looks like, even when it stands on its hind legs. This was no bear. The creature stood fully upright, like a man, but everything about its proportions was wrong. It stood at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall, with shoulders twice the width of any linebacker I'd ever seen. Its head had a slightly pointed shape at the top. Not quite conical, but definitely not round, like a human head. What struck me most was the absence of a neck. The creature's head sat directly on its shoulders, with thick, developed trapezius muscles forming a continuous line from head to shoulders. No separation, no narrowing, just raw power connecting its skull to its massive frame. Its arms hung abnormally long, reaching almost to its knees. Even through the short, dark brown fur covering its body, fur that resembled a buffalo hide more than a bear's coat, I could see the definition of powerful muscles. The short hair revealed hamstring and gluteus muscles that rippled as it took that single step upward. "Drive," Trevor whispered urgently. "Mike, drive!" I snapped out of my trance and pressed the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, and as we passed the spot where the creature had stood, I looked out my side window. It had moved further up the slope, its massive form partially obscured by trees now, but I caught a glimpse of it climbing the steep incline with disturbing ease, like it was nothing more than walking across a flat yard. "Did you see that?" I asked, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. "What the fuck was that thing?" Trevor's voice shook. "That wasn't a bear, Mike. That wasn't a goddamn bear." "I know," I said, pushing the truck faster down the dark road. "I've never seen anything like it." We drove in stunned silence for several minutes until we spotted a sign for Jarrell Cove State Park. I turned onto the access road, my mind still replaying those 5 seconds of the encounter over and over. The campground was mostly empty, which made sense for a Thursday night in late September. We found our reserve spot near the water's edge and began setting up camp with mechanical movements. Our earlier enthusiasm for the weekend fishing trip replaced by nervous energy. "You think it was some kind of mutated bear?" Trevor asked as we finished pitching the tent. "Or maybe one of those grizzly polar hybrids. They're supposed to be huge." I shook my head. Wrong build entirely. It was standing upright, naturally upright, not like a bear does temporarily. And those proportions, that wasn't any bear species I've ever heard of. We built a fire and sat beside it, each of us nursing a beer from the cooler. The adrenaline had worn off enough that we could talk about what we'd seen without our voices shaking, but every sound from the surrounding forest made us tense. "Maybe we should head back in the morning," Trevor suggested. "Skip the fishing." I considered it but shook my head. "We're already set up. Let's at least fish tomorrow morning, then decide." Trevor nodded, though I could tell he wasn't thrilled with the plan. We talked about other things, his job at the auto parts store, my recent promotion, the Seahawks' chances this season. Anything to avoid discussing what we'd seen on the road. By midnight, exhaustion overcame our unease. Trevor crawled into his sleeping bag and was snoring within minutes. I stayed up a bit longer, feeding small branches into the dying fire and listening to the night sounds around us, the lap of water against the shoreline, the rustle of wind through trees, the occasional hoot of an owl. Normal sounds, comforting sounds. I checked my watch, 1:27 a.m., and decided to turn in. I had just zipped the tent closed when I heard it. A howl. Not the familiar howl of a wolf or coyote, both of which I'd heard countless times in the Idaho backcountry. This was something else entirely. The sound started low, then rose to a perfectly sustained pitch that held for nearly 20 seconds before gradually lowering again. It was too controlled, too precise to be any canine I knew. I froze, my hand still on the zipper. The howl faded, and for a moment, Silence returned. Then came the response. From a different direction, perhaps 100 yards further away, another howl answered the first. This one had a slightly deeper timbre, but maintained the same eerie precision, a sustained note held without wavering for an impossible length of time. They were communicating. Whatever these things were, they were talking to each other. I carefully opened the tent flap and peered out. The campfire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow that barely penetrated the darkness. The moon provided some illumination, silhouetting the trees against the night sky, but I couldn't see anything moving in the forest. A third howl joined the chorus, this one from the direction of the road we'd come in on. They had us surrounded. Trevor stirred in his sleeping bag. "What's that noise?" he mumbled sleepily. "Nothing," I lied. "Just some coyotes." He rolled over and promptly fell back asleep. I envied his ability to dismiss the sounds. I knew better. These weren't coyotes, these weren't wolves, these weren't anything I'd encountered in 15 years of hunting and fishing throughout the Northwest. I sat at the tent entrance for the next hour, listening as the howls continued intermittently. Sometimes several minutes passed between calls, sometimes they overlapped. They never seemed to get closer, maintaining their distance from our campsite as if establishing a perimeter. Despite the obvious threat these creatures might pose, I didn't feel they intended to attack us. If they wanted to, they could have done so already. This felt more like observation. They were aware of us, communicating about us, but keeping their distance. Eventually, the calls became less frequent, and by 3 a.m. they had stopped completely. I closed the tent flap and lay down on my sleeping bag. Though I knew sleep wouldn't come easily, my mind kept replaying both the creature we'd seen on the road and these haunting howls, trying to connect them into something that made sense within my understanding of the natural world. Nothing fit. Morning arrived with grey light filtering through the tent fabric. I hadn't slept more than an hour total, drifting in and out of consciousness, startling awake at every sound. Trevor seemed better rested, though the events of the previous night had clearly stayed with him. "We should pack up," he said immediately after waking, not even mentioning the fishing we'd planned. I nodded, relieved he'd suggested it first. "Yeah, let's get back to Renton." We broke camp in record time, stuffing gear into bags without our usual care, collapsing the tent and shoving it unceremoniously into its sack. Within 45 minutes, we had everything loaded in the truck and were pulling away from our campsite. As we drove through the campground toward the exit, I noticed fresh tracks in the mud beside the road. Large impressions that resembled a barefoot human print, but scaled up significantly. They led from the tree line to within 20 yards of where our tent had been, then returned to the forest. I didn't point them out to Trevor. The morning sun had risen above the trees by the time we reached the bridge off Harin Island. Neither of us spoke until we were back on the mainland. "We're never talking about this to anyone," Trevor said, breaking the silence. "They'll think we're crazy." "Agreed," I replied, though I knew I wouldn't be able to forget what we'd experienced. For several weeks after our trip, I found myself researching late into the night. I started with local wildlife reports, looking for unusual bear sightings or other large mammals in the area. Finding nothing, I expanded my search to folklore and cryptid reports. What I discovered stunned me. Harin Island had a history of similar sightings going back decades. Local residents spoke of the island people, tall, powerful beings that kept to themselves in the densely forested interior. Most encounters happened at night, with witnesses describing creatures matching exactly what we had seen: the pointed head, the absent neck, the unnaturally long arms. One report from 1987 described a family who found massive footprints circling their vacation cabin each morning during a week-long stay. Another from 1998 detailed howls identical to what I'd heard, sustained calls that lasted 15 to 20 seconds, occurring in patterns that suggested communication. Most compelling was a report from 2001, just a year before our encounter. A local fisherman described seeing what he called a family of the creatures, an adult male, an adult female, and what appeared to be an adolescent, drinking from a stream at dusk. He observed them for nearly 2 minutes before they detected his presence and disappeared into the forest with surprising speed and agility. The locals had developed an unspoken agreement. Leave them alone, and they'll leave you alone. Many residents acknowledged their existence, but refused to discuss them with outsiders, fearing both ridicule and the possibility of monster hunters descending on their quiet island. It's been 20 years since that night on Harin Island. Trevor and I still fish together regularly, but we've never returned to Jarrell Cove. We've never spoken about our experience to anyone else, maintaining the pact we made that morning. But I think about it often, about what we saw in the headlights of my truck, about the howls that surrounded our camp, about the footprints I spotted as we left. I still fish all over Washington state. I've camped in places much more remote than Harin Island. But something about that encounter changed my relationship with the wilderness. I no longer assume I understand all the creatures that inhabit the dark forests of the Pacific Northwest. I know better now. I know there are things out there that don't appear in any wildlife guide, things that watch us from the shadows, things that communicate in ways we can barely comprehend, things that climb steep hillsides like they're nothing. And sometimes, late at night when I'm camping alone and the fire has burned low, I find myself listening for those perfectly pitched howls. I haven't heard them since that night, but I know they're out there, calling to each other across the darkness, sharing information I'll never understand. I won't camp on Harin Island again, but I often wonder if those creatures are still there, watching from the tree line as visitors come and go, maintaining their silent vigil over territory they've claimed as their own. Some things are better left alone, some mysteries should remain unsolved, and some places, like certain parts of Harin Island after dark, are not meant for people like us.